Nathan Garrett stood at the window of the land office in Kalispell, Montana, watching his brother Samuel sign the final papers that transferred the Garrett Timber Company into Samuel's sole possession. September 1888. The office smelled of pine tar and leather bindings. Through the wavy glass, Nathan could see the muddy main street of the town, the place where Samuel had spent the last 4 years making connections, learning the language of contracts and territorial law, while Nathan worked the timber stands their grandfather had first claimed in 1865. Their father had died in July. Joseph Garrett, crushed beneath a rolling log during a routine timber operation, his body brought down from the mountain wrapped in canvas. There had been no will. Under Montana territorial law, the property should have been divided equally between the two sons. But Samuel had produced a promissory note, witnessed and notarized, showing that Nathan owed their father $1,800, a debt allegedly incurred to cover losses when Nathan attempted to open an independent sawmill near Whitefish 3 years prior. Nathan had never opened a sawmill. He had never borrowed $1,800. He had never signed any such note. But the signature was remarkably similar to his own, and Samuel had two witnesses who swore under oath they had seen Nathan sign it. Both men were timber cruisers who had worked for the Garrett Company. Both men had steady eyes and firm voices when they testified. Both men were lying. The judge had been sympathetic but clear. The debt exceeded half the timber company's assessed value. Nathan could either buy out his brother's share and settle the fabricated debt, requiring more than $3,000 he did not have, or accept Samuel's offer. Nathan would relinquish all claim to the family timber company in exchange for Samuel forgiving the debt, and deeding Nathan a tract of mountain land their father had accepted the previous year in payment for a bad loan. Nathan took the mountain land. He signed the papers without speaking, his hand steady on the pen despite the rage that burned in his chest like hot coals. He walked out of the land office into the September sunlight and did not look back at his brother. He would never speak to Samuel again. The property consisted of 640 acres of steep mountainside in the Swan Range, elevation ranging from 4,500 to 6,200 feet. The deed described it as vertical terrain unsuitable for commercial logging, inaccessible by road, containing no merchantable timber of value. Nathan visited it on a cold October morning, riding a borrowed horse because Samuel had kept all the company's animals as part of the timber operation's assets. The land was exactly as worthless as promised. The trail ended at 4,800 feet elevation. Above that, only game trails threaded through the forest. The slopes rose at angles between 40 and 60 degrees, far too steep for conventional horse logging. Rocky outcrops jutted from the mountainside like broken teeth. Tailless fields of loose stone made footing treacherous. No creek ran at the base of the tract. The Swan River flowed 1,200 vertical feet below, accessible only by a descent that would break a horse's legs and probably its rider's neck. Most men would have seen nothing but obstacles. Nathan saw something else. He had grown up in these mountains, had learned timber from his grandfather who had come west after the Civil War with nothing but an axe and determination. Nathan knew how to read a forest the way other men read books. He could identify a tree species from 100 yards by the pattern of its bark. He could estimate board feet yield from the diameter of a trunk. He could tell good timber from bad by the way sunlight filtered through the canopy. At elevation 5,400 feet, he found what would save him: a grove of old-growth western larch, trees that had been growing when his grandfather was born, perhaps before. Their trunks rose straight as rifle barrels, 3 to 4 feet in diameter, the bark thick and deeply furrowed. Nathan dismounted and walked among them, running his hand over the rough bark, looking up into the canopy where golden needles caught the autumn light. Larch was premium timber. The wood was rot-resistant, stronger than pine or fir, the grain straight and beautiful when milled. Shipbuilders used it for masts. Bridge engineers specified it for load-bearing timbers. High-grade construction demanded it. A single one of these trees would yield 800 board feet of lumber worth $5 or $6 per thousand board feet at the mills down in the valley. Nathan counted slowly, moving through the grove, marking trees in his mind. 400 trees, maybe more. A fortune in timber if there was any way to get it down the mountain. But there was no way. The slopes were too steep for horse teams. A conventional logging operation would require roads carved into the mountainside, switchbacks, graded approaches. That meant crews of men, months of work, thousands of dollars in capital Nathan did not have. Flume systems required water sources at elevation, streams that could be dammed and released to float logs down wooden channels. There were no streams here. The snow that fell in winter soaked into the porous volcanic soil and emerged as springs thousands of feet below. Nathan made camp that first night beneath the larch trees, rolled in a single blanket, his saddle for a pillow. The temperature dropped below freezing. He built a small fire and sat watching the flames, thinking about Samuel in the valley below, sleeping in the house their father built, managing the timber company their grandfather started, living a life built on lies and forged signatures. The isolation was absolute. No sound reached him from the valley. The wind moved through the larch needles with a sound like rushing water. An elk bugled somewhere in the darkness, the call echoing off the mountain face. Nathan had spent his entire life surrounded by the sounds of a working timber camp, the ring of axes, the rasp of crosscut saws, the shouts of men, and the creak of loaded wagons. The silence of the high mountain felt like a physical presence, something that pressed against his ears and made his own breathing seem loud. He explored for 3 days, leading his horse along the treacherous game trails, mapping the property in his mind. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, at elevation 5,200 feet, he found the stone cabin. It sat in a small clearing, built into the hillside itself, the back wall formed by the living rock of the mountain. The structure measured perhaps 12 feet by 14, the walls constructed of fieldstone 3 feet thick at the base. The roof had partially collapsed, the shakes rotted and scattered. The door hung from a single leather hinge. Nathan stepped inside. The floor was dirt, packed hard by years of use and now covered with fallen debris and animal droppings. But the walls were solid. He could see where the builder had carefully selected and fitted each stone, the gaps chinked with clay that had hardened like concrete. A fireplace occupied the rear wall, carved directly into the mountain stone, the chimney a natural cleft that rose up through the rock face. He learned later that Basque shepherds had built the cabin in the 1870s, when they ran sheep in the high meadows before the timber companies bought up the land and drove them out. The shepherds were gone now, scattered to other ranges or returned to the old country. The cabin stood abandoned, slowly surrendering to weather and time. Nathan stood in that ruined structure and made his decision. He would make this habitable. He would survive the winter here, and he would find a way to harvest the timber that everyone said could not be harvested. He spent 2 weeks on the work. He rode down to Kalispell and spent $8 of his remaining money on supplies: nails, rope, a second axe, a small crosscut saw, canvas for a door. He bought beans and coffee and salt pork, enough to last a month if he was careful. The clerk at the general store looked at him with curiosity, this tall, weathered man buying supplies for mountain living as September turned to October and the first hard frosts arrived. Nathan carried everything up the mountain in stages, packing the supplies on the borrowed horse, leading it carefully up the steep trail. He felled large trees at the edge of his property line, trees that would have to come down eventually anyway. He split shakes by hand, using a froe and mallet, working from first light until his hands bled and his shoulders screamed. The larch split clean and straight, the golden wood still fragrant with sap. He rebuilt the roof in sections, replacing the rotted shakes with new ones, overlapping them the way his grandfather had taught him, each course covering the gaps in the course below. He constructed a chimney cap from flat stones, angling it to draw properly and keep out rain. He dug a drainage trench around the foundation, directing water away from the walls. He built a door frame from straight-grained larch, and mounted a door he constructed from hand-hewn planks, fitting it so tightly that only the thinnest line of light showed around the edges. Inside, he created a bed platform against one wall, raising it off the dirt floor on a frame of small logs. He built a table from a single piece of larch plank, the surface planed smooth with a drawknife. His chairs were sections of logs stood on end. He drove wooden pegs into the walls to hang his few possessions: 2 shirts, a spare pair of wool pants, his tools, each one cleaned and oiled and hung in its proper place. 50 feet from the cabin, a spring emerged from the rock face, the water cold and clear, flowing year-round regardless of drought or freeze. Nathan dug a small basin to catch the water, lining it with flat stones. He would never lack for water as long as he stayed here. By the first week of November, he had a dwelling that stayed dry and warm. The stone walls held heat from the fire like a blessing. The chimney drew clean and steady. When Nathan lay in his bed at night, listening to the wind in the pines, he could almost forget that this cabin represented everything he had left in the world. Almost. The loneliness was profound in a way he had not anticipated. His nearest neighbor lived 6 miles down the mountain, a man Nathan had never met. No one visited. The occasional hunter might pass through, following elk trails, but Nathan's cabin sat well off the main game routes. At night, the only sounds were the wind, the crack of freezing timber, the distant calls of wolves hunting in the darkness below. Nathan lay awake those first weeks, feeling the full weight of what Samuel had stolen. Not just the timber company, though that was tangible enough, but the community connections, the reputation the Garrett name had built over 3 generations, the place in Valley society that came from being part of an established family operation. Samuel had severed all of that with forged documents and purchased testimony. Nathan was alone on a mountain with nothing but 640 acres everyone agreed was worthless, and a determination that felt sometimes like the only thing keeping him alive. He needed to make the mountain pay. He needed to find a way to harvest the timber. But first he needed to survive the winter, and winter in the Swan Range at 5,000 feet came hard and stayed long. November brought the first heavy snows. Nathan woke one morning to find 2 feet of new snow blanketing the clearing, the branches of the surrounding pines bent low under the weight. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees. His breath frosted in the air inside the cabin, despite the fire burning in the hearth. He spent those weeks learning the rhythms of high-country winter. He cut firewood, great stacks of it, piling it against the cabin walls where it would stay dry under the eaves. He hunted when the weather allowed, taking deer and elk, hanging the meat to freeze in the natural cold storage of the mountain winter. He rationed his supplies carefully, making each pound of beans last, each ounce of coffee stretch. The work was constant and necessary. Hauling water from the spring, feeding the fire, maintaining his tools, hunting, preparing food. Every task took longer in the deep snow and bitter cold. Simple errands that would take minutes in summer consumed hours in winter. Nathan learned to move efficiently, to plan each trip outside the cabin, to bundle tasks together. He also learned something else. In the absolute solitude, in the long dark evenings with nothing but firelight and his own thoughts, Nathan discovered that he could think with a clarity he had never experienced in the busy chaos of the timber camp. He began to study his land with the focus of a man who had no other choice. He made sketches in a notebook he had brought from the valley, drawing maps of his property, marking the location of each significant larch grove, noting the slope angles, the exposure to sun and wind, the proximity to the unusable logging routes below. He drew cross-sections of the mountain, trying to visualize how logs might be moved downward using nothing but gravity. In December, during a brief warming spell when the temperature climbed to 20 degrees and felt almost pleasant by comparison, Nathan hiked to the upper reaches of his property. The snow was 4 feet deep in places, and he moved slowly, sometimes sinking to his waist, using a long pole to probe ahead for hidden obstacles. At elevation 5,800 feet, he found something that would change everything. A narrow defile cut into the mountain face, a channel perhaps 5 feet wide carved by ancient glacial action. The stone sides rose sheer and smooth, polished by centuries of ice flow. The channel ran nearly straight down the mountain, descending 1,100 vertical feet over a horizontal distance of perhaps a quarter mile. Nathan stood at the top of this natural chute and felt his heart begin to pound with something other than exertion. This was a natural log flume. If he could get logs into the channel at the top, gravity would send them down. They would slide on snow in winter, on bare stone in summer. The smooth granite walls would guide them, keep them from tumbling off the mountain. But control would be everything. Logs sliding down 1,100 vertical feet would accelerate to dangerous speeds. They would shatter when they hit the bottom. They would kill anyone in their path. Nathan had seen what happened when logs got away from timber crews, had seen men crushed, had helped bury men who had been in the wrong place when tons of wood began to move. He descended carefully, following the chute down, studying every feature. Near the bottom, the channel widened slightly and the angle eased. That would slow the logs naturally, but not enough. He would need to build control structures, brake systems, ways to manage the descent. Nathan returned to his cabin as the brief thaw ended and the temperature plunged again. That night, sitting by his fire, he began to sketch designs. Wooden rails along the chute sides that could be adjusted to increase friction. Log cribs at the top to stage the timber, to release logs one at a time. Rope and pulley systems for lowering logs into the chute at controlled speeds. He had no formal engineering training, but he had spent his entire life around timber and the tools and techniques used to move it. He had watched his father and grandfather solve problems through trial and error, through stubbornness and experimentation. He would do the same. The winter stretched on. January brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero on the coldest nights. Nathan burned through his firewood faster than anticipated and spent days cutting more, working in cold so intense that the sap in living trees froze and made them ring like iron when his axe struck. His hands cracked and bled despite the grease he rubbed into them. His face became weathered and dark from the reflection of sun off snow. But he was learning to read the weather by the feel of the wind and the color of the sky, learning which trees made the best firewood, which burned hot and which burned long, learning to move through deep snow efficiently, to judge when ice was safe to cross and when it would give way, learning that he could endure cold and loneliness and grinding daily labor that never seemed to end. In February, a Chinook wind arrived, the temperature soaring to 40 degrees in a matter of hours. The snow began to melt and settle. Nathan used the break in the weather to descend to the valley. He rode the borrowed horse down the treacherous trail, leading it carefully over ice-glazed rocks, following the switchbacks that dropped through the forest. Kalispell looked strange to him after months on the mountain. The buildings seemed too close together. The noise of wagons and voices felt overwhelming. People stared at him, this lean, hard man in patched clothes, his beard long and his eyes holding the distant look of someone who has spent too long alone. He went to the hardware store and spent precious dollars on rope and iron hardware. He bought a new crosscut saw, 7 feet long, the teeth sharp and gleaming. He purchased canvas and more nails. The clerk asked what he was building up there on the mountain. Nathan just said he was making improvements. At the general store, he overheard men talking about timber prices. The winter had been hard on logging operations throughout the territory. Many camps had shut down early, unable to work in the extreme cold. Spring would bring high demand for lumber as construction resumed. Prices were expected to rise. Nathan stored this information away. If he could harvest his larch, if he could get it down the mountain and to a mill, the timing might be perfect. He rode back up the mountain as the Chinook ended and the cold returned. But something had shifted in him during those months of isolation. The anger at Samuel had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else. A fierce determination not just to survive, but to succeed. To prove that the worthless land contained value that only he could unlock. To build something from nothing through knowledge and labor and absolute refusal to give up. March brought the deepest snow of the winter. 6 feet fell in a single week. Nathan was trapped in the cabin for days. The snow piled so high against the door that he had to dig a tunnel to get out. He used the time to maintain his tools, to refine his plans for the logging operation he would attempt. He studied the notebook where he had sketched the natural chute, adding details, working through problems on paper. How to construct the log crib, how to attach brake rails, how to position himself safely while sending logs down. He drew and erased and drew again, each iteration bringing him closer to a workable system. April arrived with warming temperatures and the sound of water everywhere. Snowmelt rushed down every creek and gully. The spring near the cabin flowed twice as fast, the overflow creating a small stream that tumbled down the mountain. Nathan watched the water and thought about logs sliding on snow, about gravity and friction and controlled descent. He was ready to test his theories, but first he needed to learn more about what happened to logs after they left the mountain. He needed to understand river driving, mill operations, timber markets. He needed knowledge he did not possess. In late April, when the high trail became passable again, Nathan descended to the valley. He went to Kalispell with a specific purpose. He had heard talk of a Norwegian logger named Lars Anderson who specialized in river driving, the dangerous work of floating logs down streams and rivers to the mills. Nathan found Lars at a saloon, arguing with a mill owner about payment for a completed drive. Lars was a stocky man in his late 50s, his face weathered to the texture of old leather, his hands scarred from decades of working with timber and water. He spoke English with a thick accent, gesturing forcefully as he made his point about the agreed-upon price. Nathan waited until the argument concluded, Lars getting his money and the mill owner stalking away muttering. Then Nathan introduced himself. Lars looked him over with sharp blue eyes. He saw the worn clothes, the scarred hands, the lean build of a man who had spent a hard winter doing hard work. Nathan explained his situation simply. He had premium larch timber. He had a mountain too steep for conventional logging. He had a natural chute that might work for getting logs down. But he knew nothing about what happened next, about moving logs on water, about dealing with mills and buyers. Lars listened without interrupting. When Nathan finished, the old Norwegian smiled, showing teeth gaps where years of pipe smoking had taken their toll. He said one sentence that would change everything. Logs float, rivers flow, you do not fight either, you work with both. Nathan stood in the noisy saloon, surrounded by the smell of tobacco and spilled beer, and felt something loosen in his chest. Here was a man who understood timber from a different angle, who had knowledge Nathan needed. Here was a teacher, if Nathan could convince him. He asked Lars if he would be willing to teach him river driving techniques in exchange for labor. Nathan would work Lars's current contracts, learning as he went. When the time came to move Nathan's timber, Lars could advise on the best methods. Lars considered this. He looked at Nathan's hands, at the scars and calluses that told their own story of hard work. He asked Nathan one question. "You afraid of cold water and dangerous work?" Nathan thought of the winter he had just survived alone on the mountain. He thought of the stone cabin and the isolation, and the nights when the temperature dropped to 30 below, and he wondered if he would see morning. He met Lars's eyes and said simply no. Lars nodded. They shook hands. The partnership that would make Nathan's fortune began in that moment, though neither man knew it yet. Nathan spent May and June working with Lars on river drives throughout the Flathead drainage. He learned to read water the way he had learned to read timber, to see where currents ran fast and where they slowed, to identify where logs would jam and how to break those jams safely. He learned to use a peavey, the long-handled tool with a pivoting hook that allowed one man to roll and maneuver logs weighing thousands of pounds. He learned that river driving killed men regularly. Logs rolled without warning. Jams broke explosively, releasing tons of timber in seconds. Cold water sapped strength and led to drowning. Lars showed Nathan the scars on his own body, the marks of close calls and mistakes survived by luck as much as skill. But Lars also showed Nathan something else. The old Norwegian took him to a site where they were about to begin a spring drive. A small creek, swollen with snowmelt, rushed down from the mountains. Stacked along its banks were hundreds of logs, cut during the winter and waiting for the high water. Lars explained the technique they called splash damming. Build a temporary dam, let water accumulate behind it, stack logs below the dam, then blow the dam and release everything at once. The artificial flood would carry logs down creeks too small to float them under normal conditions. Nathan watched the operation. The dam was crude but effective, constructed of logs and rocks and earth. When they blew it with black powder charges, the accumulated water roared down the creek in a brown torrent, carrying logs like matchsticks, scouring the streambed, overwhelming anything in its path. That night, camping beside the creek, Lars told Nathan about winter logging in Norway. They would cut timber in the mountains during the coldest months when snow was deepest. The logs would be stacked on slopes. When spring arrived, the melting snow became a lubricant. Logs would slide on the snowpack, descending mountains without horses or mechanical assistance. Nathan sat very still, watching the firelight play across Lars's weathered face. He thought about his natural chute, about 640 acres of larch timber, about winter snow that accumulated 6 feet deep. He asked Lars carefully whether such techniques could work on very steep slopes, on mountains where conventional logging was impossible. Lars shrugged. Steep is what you make of it. Norwegians logged steeper slopes than anything in Montana. The key was control. Speed had to be managed or logs would destroy themselves. But with proper technique, with careful planning, mountains could be logged that seemed impossible. Nathan returned to his cabin in early July with a head full of new knowledge and a plan beginning to take shape. The summer was short at high elevation. He would use it to prepare for a winter logging operation unlike anything attempted in Montana territory. He would cut his larch during the coldest months, stack it near the natural chute, and send it down on the spring snowmelt. He spent July and August in preparation. He built a log crib at the top of the chute, a structure of heavy timbers that would hold logs and release them one at a time. He installed wooden rails along the upper sections of the chute, rails that could be adjusted to increase friction and slow descent. He constructed a system of rope and pulleys that would allow him to lower logs into the chute at controlled speeds rather than simply pushing them in and hoping. The work was technical and demanding. Every measurement mattered. Every joint had to be solid. A failure in the control system could mean logs careening out of control, could mean destruction of timber and possibly death for Nathan if he was caught in the wrong position. He worked alone through the summer heat, carrying tools and materials up to the high elevations, building his systems piece by piece. His hands developed new calluses. His shoulders and back grew stronger from the constant lifting and carrying. He became lean and hard, every ounce of excess burned away by labor and simple food. In September, Lars visited the mountain cabin, climbing up to see what Nathan had built. The old Norwegian examined the chute, the control structures, the careful planning evident in every detail. He nodded slowly, running his scarred hands over the wooden rails, testing the rope systems. He told Nathan it might work. The design was sound, but it had never been tested. The first log down would tell them whether Nathan's winter of planning had value or whether he had wasted his time. Lars also told Nathan something else. He had been asking around in the valley, talking to mill owners. There was a woman named Margaret Lindstrom who operated a sawmill on Flathead Lake. Her husband had drowned 3 years earlier during a river drive, leaving her with the mill and debts. She had kept the operation running, had earned a reputation for fair dealing and quality work. If Nathan got his timber down the mountain and down the river, Margaret would be the person to talk to about milling and sales. Nathan filed this information away. First, he had to prove his timber could be harvested at all. October arrived with the changing colors that marked high country autumn. The larch needles turned golden, covering the forest floor like treasure. Nathan began his preparations for winter logging. He sharpened his saws until they would shave hair. He oiled his tools and checked every piece of equipment. He stocked his cabin with supplies for the hard months ahead. November brought the first serious snows. Nathan began cutting. He worked alone, felling trees with a crosscut saw, a brutal task for one man. Each tree took hours. He would saw until his arms trembled with exhaustion, rest briefly, then saw again. The saw bit into the dense larch wood, throwing golden sawdust, the rhythm of the work becoming meditative. He cut only the best trees, straight-trunked, no visible defects, the bark showing the deep furrows that indicated old-growth quality. Each tree was a calculated decision. He walked around it, examining it from every angle, determining the fall path that would minimize damage and position the log for bucking into manageable lengths. When a tree fell, the impact shook the mountain. Snow cascaded from surrounding trees. The sound echoed through the forest. Nathan would stand for a moment, breathing hard, watching the giant settle into its new position. Then he would begin the work of limbing and bucking, cutting away branches, sawing the trunk into 16-foot lengths. By late December, he had 40 trees down and bucked, producing 220 logs. They lay in the snow near the top of the natural chute, stacked and waiting for spring. The work had been brutal. Nathan's hands were covered with cuts that would not heal in the cold. His back ached constantly. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose, but the timber was ready. January brought temperatures that made November seem warm. 30 below became common. Nathan kept working, though some days he could only manage an hour or two before the cold drove him back to the cabin. The saw froze in the cuts. His breath crystallized on his beard. His fingers lost feeling even through heavy gloves. But he was learning his limitations, learning to read his body and know when to push and when to stop. He was learning that determination alone was not enough, that surviving winter logging required respecting the cold and the work and the mountain. February brought Chinook winds again, brief warmings that turned the snow soft and heavy. Nathan used these breaks to refine his control systems, to make adjustments to the brake rails, to test the rope systems under load. March arrived with the deepest snow and the knowledge that spring was coming. Nathan had 220 logs ready to go. He had systems in place. He had learned from Lars what needed to happen next. Now he just needed to wait for the melt and hope that everything he had built would work when the moment came. April brought warming temperatures and the sound of running water. The snowpack began to settle and compress. Nathan watched the weather obsessively, waiting for the precise moment when conditions would be right. In late April, that moment arrived. The temperature had stayed above freezing for 3 days. The snow was wet and heavy, beginning to slide on slopes throughout the mountains. The surface had a layer of melt water that would act as lubrication. It was time. Nathan positioned himself at the top of the chute with his control systems ready. He selected a single log, average size, no obvious defects. This would be his test. Everything he had worked toward for the past year came down to this moment. He used the rope and pulley system to lower the log into position at the head of the chute. The log weighed perhaps 1,200 pounds. It sat on the wet snow, ready to slide. Nathan pulled the release rope. The log began to move. It accelerated faster than he expected, sliding on the snow and the smooth granite. Within seconds it was moving at terrible speed, disappearing down the chute in a blur of motion. Nathan heard it hit the brake rails, heard the impact of wood on wood, heard the log scraping against the stone walls. Then silence. He descended as quickly as the deep snow allowed, following the chute down, his heart pounding. At the bottom he found the log. It had exited the chute and come to rest on the gentler slope below, exactly as planned. But it was shattered. The force of the descent had split it lengthwise. Pieces of premium larch lay scattered across the snow, worthless for milling. Nathan stood looking at the wreckage of his test and felt despair settle over him like the cold. He had spent a year preparing for this. He had survived a brutal winter. He had cut and positioned 200 logs, and his system did not work. The logs could not survive the descent. He climbed back to his cabin as afternoon faded to evening. He built up his fire and sat staring at the flames, too exhausted and disappointed to eat. Outside, the spring melt continued its work, water running everywhere, snow settling and sliding. Nathan's mountain of worthless land remained worthless. His timber remained inaccessible. Samuel's betrayal remained unavenged. Everything remained exactly as it had been, except Nathan was a year older and a year more isolated and no closer to any kind of success. He fell asleep that night with the bitter taste of failure in his mouth, wondering if Samuel had been right all along. Maybe the mountain was worthless. Maybe Nathan was a fool for thinking he could make it pay. Maybe he should give up, leave Montana, start over somewhere else with nothing to remind him of everything he had lost. But morning came as it always did, cold and clear. Nathan woke and built up his fire and made coffee from grounds he had used twice already. He sat at his rough table and opened his notebook to the pages where he had sketched the chute system. He studied his drawings, thinking about what had happened. The log had survived the upper section where the brake rails were installed. It had shattered in the lower section where the chute was unmodified. The solution was obvious. He needed brake rails along the entire length of the chute, not just the top section. It would take weeks to install. The snow was melting rapidly. He might miss this spring's opportunity entirely. But he had 200 logs waiting and nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. Nathan returned to the chute. He spent 3 weeks installing additional brake rails, working in wet snow and spring mud, carrying materials up and down the mountain, building the control structures that should have been there from the beginning. In mid-May, he tried again. 1 log, carefully controlled, released into the improved system. This time the log descended in a controlled slide. It hit the brake rails repeatedly, each impact slowing it slightly, keeping the speed manageable. It exited the chute and came to rest on the lower slope intact. Nathan scrambled down and examined it. Some surface damage where it had hit the rails. But the log was solid, still valuable, still worth milling. He stood in the spring sunlight, looking at that single log, and felt something break open in his chest. Relief and vindication and fierce joy all mixed together. It worked. His system worked. Over the next 3 weeks, he sent 200 logs down the mountain. He worked from dawn to dark, releasing logs one at a time, descending to check each one, climbing back up to release the next. The physical labor was crushing, but each log that came down intact was a victory, was proof that the worthless mountain could produce value. He lost 40 logs to various failures. Some shattered despite the brake rails. Some tumbled out of the chute and were lost in the forest. But 160 logs reached the bottom intact and ready to transport. Now came the next challenge, getting them to a mill. Nathan rigged a system to skid logs down to the Swan River using the remaining snowpack. It took another 2 weeks of brutal work, but finally he had his timber at water's edge. Lars arrived as promised, bringing 2 other Norwegian loggers to help with the river drive. They spent a day organizing the logs, binding them into rafts, planning the route down the Swan River to Flathead Lake. The drive took 3 days. They worked in cold water, breaking jams, navigating rapids, keeping the timber moving. Nathan learned that river driving was every bit as dangerous as Lars had warned. On the second day, a jam broke while Nathan was standing on it. He fell into the rushing water, went under, came up gasping, managed to grab a passing log and pull himself out before the cold sapped his strength. Lars just grinned and said that now Nathan was truly a river driver, having been in the water and survived. They lost 15 more logs during the drive, hung up on rocks or sunk in deep pools. But 145 logs reached Flathead Lake and the Lindstrom sawmill. Margaret Lindstrom stood on the dock as they arrived, a tall woman with Swedish features and capable hands. She examined the timber with an expert eye, walking along the floating logs, checking the quality, looking for defects. She offered $4.50 per 1,000 board feet. Nathan had no idea if this was fair. Lars whispered that it was a good price for larch of this quality. Nathan countered at $5. Margaret smiled slightly and said she would pay $4.75 for this delivery, but $5 per 1,000 for future deliveries if the quality remained consistent. Nathan's 145 logs averaged 800 board feet each. Total timber, 116,000 board feet. At $4.75 per 1,000, that meant $551. Nathan had spent 18 months on the mountain. He had survived isolation and winter cold and grinding labor. He had built systems from scratch with no training and no help. And now he held a check for $551, more money than he had ever possessed at one time. Margaret asked when he could deliver more timber. Nathan said next spring, if all went well. Maybe 160 logs, maybe more. She nodded and said she would hold that capacity for him. Good larch was always in demand. Nathan rode back up the mountain with the check in his pocket and knowledge flooding through him. The mountain could produce. His systems worked. He had found a buyer who would pay fair prices. Everything was possible now. Samuel had given him worthless land thinking it was punishment, but Nathan had transformed that punishment into opportunity. The mountain that was supposed to be his defeat had become his salvation. He reached his stone cabin as evening fell. He built up his fire and sat at his table and looked at the check one more time before carefully putting it away. Tomorrow, he would ride to Kalispell and deposit it in the bank. Then he would buy supplies for next winter's logging. Better tools, more rope, materials to expand his operations. But tonight he just sat in his cabin and felt the profound satisfaction of a man who has taken nothing and made something through his own labor and determination, and refusal to accept what everyone else believed was true. The worthless mountain was not worthless. Samuel's betrayal had not destroyed him, and Nathan Garrett, alone in a stone cabin at 5,000 feet with scarred hands and a knowledge earned through brutal experience, knew that he had only just begun. Nathan deposited the check at the Kalispell Bank on a June morning when the town was just beginning to wake. The clerk looked at the amount and then at Nathan, this weathered man in patched clothes whose hands bore the scars of timber work. $551 was more than most men in the valley earned in a year. The clerk asked no questions, just recorded the deposit and handed Nathan a receipt with fingers that had never known calluses, that had never frozen on a saw handle at 20 below zero. Nathan stood at the counter for a moment after the transaction completed, feeling the weight of what this money represented. Not just dollars and cents, but proof that the mountain could produce, that his systems worked, that the isolation and brutal labor had purpose beyond simple survival. This check was validation, was evidence that worthless land could become valuable through knowledge and determination. He used $40 to buy supplies. Better tools this time. A new crosscut saw with raker teeth designed specifically for hardwoods, the blade nearly 8 feet long, the steel Swedish-made and guaranteed to hold an edge through months of cutting. A proper peavey with an iron hook that had been forged rather than cast, the handle straight-grained ash that would not splinter under stress. Canvas gloves reinforced with leather at the pressure points where blisters formed and broke and formed again. Salt pork and beans and coffee, real Arbuckle's coffee, not the chicory blend he had been stretching through the winter. He bought a second wool blanket, thick Hudson Bay wool that would keep him warm even when wet. He bought a tin of grease for his boots and hands, lanolin mixed with tallow that would protect skin from the brutal drying effects of mountain cold. The merchant who sold him these supplies was the same man who had looked at Nathan with curiosity the previous fall when Nathan bought canvas for his cabin door. Now that merchant's attitude had shifted subtly. He asked about the timber delivery, about the quality of the larch, about whether Nathan planned to harvest again next season. Word had spread through the valley. The hermit on the mountain was becoming known as a logger who delivered quality, who met commitments, who understood timber in ways that went beyond simple cutting. Nathan answered the questions briefly, aware that every word he spoke would be repeated, would become part of his reputation. Yes, he planned to harvest again. Yes, the quality would remain consistent. No, he was not interested in partnerships or investors. He worked alone, worked his own land, controlled his own operation. The rest of the money stayed in the bank, earning interest at 3% per year. $511 growing slowly, compounding, becoming the foundation of something larger. Nathan had learned young that cash in hand could disappear through carelessness or bad luck, through a moment of poor judgment or simple misfortune. But money in a bank account represented security, represented choices, represented the ability to invest in better equipment or hire help when needed. He rode back up the mountain with his supplies packed carefully on the borrowed horse, already planning next winter's harvest. The trail seemed less difficult now, the switchbacks familiar, the landmarks recognizable. This was becoming his country, this vertical terrain that everyone else dismissed as worthless. He knew which stones were stable and which would shift under weight. He knew where springs emerged in summer and where snowdrifts persisted late into spring. He knew the trees, not just as timber but as individuals, each one with its own character and history written in bark and branch pattern. Summer at 5,000 feet was brief and precious, a narrow window between the last snow and the first snow when the mountain revealed itself without the concealment of winter white. Nathan spent July and August preparing for the next logging season, working with the focused intensity of a man who understood that preparation prevented failure. He improved his control systems on the natural chute, reinforcing the brake rails where stress had revealed weaknesses, adding additional safety features based on what he had learned during the spring descent operations. Each brake rail was positioned at a precise angle, calculated to create just enough friction to slow logs without causing them to jam or tumble sideways. He repaired the stone cabin's roof where winter weather had worked loose several shakes, replacing damaged pieces with new ones he split from larch heartwood. The work required precision. Each shake had to overlap properly, had to be thick enough to shed water but not so thick that weight became a problem. He worked on hands and knees on the steep roof pitch, feeling the solid stone walls beneath him, appreciating again the shepherds who had built this structure with such care decades ago. He cut and stacked firewood, great cords of it, enough to last through the coming winter with surplus to spare. The work followed a rhythm older than memory. Select a dead standing tree, one whose wood was dry but not yet rotting. Fall it safely, limb it, bucket into stove lengths, split the rounds with a maul and wedges, stack the split wood to allow air circulation. The pile grew alongside the cabin wall, each piece positioned so water would drain away, so the wood would cure further during the late summer sunshine. But he also did something new. He began mapping his timber more carefully, walking the boundaries of his 640 acres with a surveyor's attention to detail, marking trees in a notebook with precise locations and estimated yields. He learned to assess standing timber the way Margaret assessed cut logs, looking for defects invisible to untrained eyes, reading the small signs that indicated internal problems. A scar on the bark might mean a fire decades past had damaged heartwood. A lean in the trunk could indicate rot in the root system. The pattern of branches sometimes revealed where lightning had struck, where wood would be splintered and worthless inside a healthy-looking exterior. He found that his property held more premium larch than he had first calculated. Not just the obvious groves where mature trees clustered together, but scattered individuals throughout the tract, trees that had survived fires and storms and centuries of mountain, weather to grow larger than their neighbors. Some of these trees had been saplings when his grandfather was born. Some had watched the first white men enter these mountains, had stood silent witness to the displacement of the tribes who had hunted these slopes for thousands of years before. If he harvested selectively, taking only the mature trees and leaving younger growth to continue, the forest would sustain logging operations for decades. The mountain could produce value year after year if he managed it wisely, if he resisted the temptation to cut everything at once for immediate profit. This was the difference between mining and farming, between extraction and cultivation. Samuel's approach to timber had always been extractive, clear cutting stands and moving on. Nathan was learning to think in longer cycles, to see the forest as a renewable resource that could support him for a lifetime if he treated it with respect. August brought Margaret Lindstrom to the mountain. She arrived on horseback, riding astride like a man, wearing practical canvas pants and a wool shirt that had faded from repeated washing. She had hired a guide to lead her up the treacherous trail, a local man who knew the switchbacks, but she sent him back down once they reached Nathan's cabin. She wanted to see the timber operation for herself, to understand where her lumber came from, to meet the source of the premium larch that had been generating demand at her mill. Nathan showed her the larch groves, explaining how he selected trees, pointing out the subtle indicators he used to choose which individuals to harvest. He showed her a tree marked for cutting, explained why this particular specimen was ready. The bark pattern indicated maturity. The absence of low branches suggested straight grain throughout. The diameter promised substantial board feet yield. Margaret listened with the focused attention of someone who understood timber at a level deeper than most, someone who saw not just wood, but the living process that created that wood over decades and centuries. She asked technical questions that revealed the depth of her knowledge. She wanted to know about grain orientation in trees growing on steep slopes. She asked whether seasonal moisture content varied with elevation. She questioned which trees would produce the clearest lumber when milled, which would have tight grain versus open grain, which would show the beautiful color that made larch so desirable for high-quality applications. Nathan found himself explaining things he had never articulated before, knowledge that had been instinctive becoming conscious through the act of teaching. He discovered he enjoyed this exchange, this mutual exploration of timber science with someone who cared as much about quality as he did. They stood together at the top of the natural chute, looking down the polished granite channel that dropped away into the forest below like a stone river frozen mid-flow. Margaret said it was the most improbable logging operation she had ever seen, and she said it with admiration rather than criticism. She said most men would have looked at this mountain and seen exactly what the deed claimed it was: worthless vertical terrain unsuitable for commercial harvest. But Nathan had seen possibility where others saw only obstacles, had looked at problems and imagined solutions rather than accepting impossibility. Nathan felt something shift in his chest when she said this, a recognition that Margaret understood not just his operation but him, understood the determination that drove him to solve problems that seemed unsolvable. Few people in his life had seen him clearly. His father had valued him as a worker, but not as a thinker. Samuel had always dismissed Nathan's practical skills as inferior to his own education in contracts and commerce. But Margaret looked at what Nathan had built and recognized intelligence, recognized creative problem-solving of the highest order. She asked if he could deliver specific dimensions. Her customers sometimes needed particular sizes, requirements that were non-standard. Squared timbers for barn frames, heavy beams for bridge construction, specific lengths for specialty applications. The logs Nathan delivered were excellent quality, but random dimensions meant she had to mill them into standard sizes, creating waste. If Nathan could deliver timber already dressed to specification, cut to exact dimensions before transport, it would save milling time and increase yield. Nathan said he could learn to hew timber to specification. He had watched his grandfather square logs with a broadaxe, had seen the technique demonstrated but never mastered it himself. The work required skill and precision, required the ability to read grain and remove wood in controlled amounts without damaging what remained. With practice, he could deliver exactly what Margaret's customers needed. Margaret offered to pay a premium for dressed timbers, $8 per 1,000 board feet instead of 5, but only if the work was precise, if the timbers met exact specifications within tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. She would provide detailed drawings showing what each customer needed, showing dimensions and tolerances and species requirements. Nathan agreed without hesitation. The extra income would accelerate his plans, would let him hire help sooner, would transform his operation from subsistence to genuine profit. More importantly, it would give him new skills, would add to his knowledge base in ways that made him more valuable as a timber contractor. Margaret stayed the night at the cabin, sleeping in Nathan's bed while he rolled in blankets by the fire, maintaining the propriety that Montana Territory society demanded even in wilderness settings. In the morning, she made coffee that was better than anything Nathan had brewed himself, using the same water and the same pot but somehow producing a result that was smoother, richer, more satisfying. She cooked breakfast over his fire, simple fare, but prepared with an efficiency that spoke of years feeding herself and managing a household alone. They talked about timber markets while they ate, about construction trends throughout Montana and Idaho territories, about the railroad expansion that was driving demand for quality lumber. Margaret explained the economics of sawmilling, the costs involved, the challenges of managing inventory and cash flow, the constant pressure to balance quality against production speed. Nathan described his harvesting methods, the constraints of working alone, the careful calculations required to ensure each log's value exceeded the cost of extracting it. Before she left, Margaret told Nathan something that would prove important. The Lutheran church in Kalispell was planning to build a new structure. The existing building had been constructed quickly from green pine 15 years earlier and was already showing rot in the sill timbers and floor joists. The congregation wanted something that would last, something beautiful enough to honor their worship. They were soliciting bids for the timber contract, seeking suppliers who could provide the quality and quantity needed. Margaret said they wanted western larch for the primary structure. Rot-resistant, strong, the grain beautiful when finished with linseed oil to bring out the natural golden color. A church built from larch would stand for 100 years, would outlast everyone who built it, would shelter generations not yet born. The contract would be substantial. Perhaps 60 major timbers for the frame, 200 or more boards for walls and flooring. Maybe $1,200 worth of work, delivered and milled to specification. Nathan filed this information carefully, turning it over in his mind, calculating what it would require. $1,200 was more than twice what he had earned from his first harvest. A contract that size would establish his reputation beyond question, would prove his operation could handle large-scale work, would position him as a serious timber contractor rather than a mountain hermit who got lucky once. Margaret rode down the mountain in the late morning light, sitting straight in the saddle, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years managing both a business and a life alone. Nathan stood watching until she disappeared around a switchback in the trail, watching until the sound of her horse's hooves on stone faded into the general quiet of the mountain. He felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that might have been loneliness or might have been the first recognition that he valued Margaret's company in ways that went beyond business partnership, in ways that had nothing to do with lumber and mill contracts and timber specifications. He had been alone on the mountain for more than a year. The isolation had been necessary, had forged him into someone harder and more capable than the man who walked out of that lawyer's office in Kalispell. But Margaret's visit had revealed what that isolation cost, had shown him that he missed conversation, missed the presence of someone who understood his work, missed simple human connection. The feeling unsettled him. He had taught himself not to need people, had learned to find satisfaction in the work itself and in his own thoughts. But something had shifted during those hours with Margaret, during her questions and observations, and the quiet competence she displayed in everything from making coffee to reading timber grain. She was the first person since his father's death who had treated Nathan's knowledge with respect, who had recognized that practical skill and theoretical education were equally valuable forms of intelligence. Nathan shook off these thoughts and returned to work. Contemplating what he did not have was a luxury he could not afford. The mountain demanded constant attention, always more firewood to cut, more systems to improve, more preparation for the challenges ahead. September arrived with the golden turning of the larch needles. Nathan descended to Kalispell to inquire about the church contract. The building committee consisted of 5 men, merchants and businessmen, respectable members of the community. They met with Nathan in the church's current building, a drafty structure that smelled of damp wood and candle wax. They showed him architectural drawings for the proposed new church. A simple design, clean lines, but requiring timber of substantial dimensions. 8 by 8 timbers for the primary posts, 20 feet long. 6 by 12 beams for the roof structure. Planed boards for walls and flooring, all tongue and groove joinery. The committee chairman asked Nathan if he could supply Western larch in these specifications. Nathan said he could. They asked about delivery timeline. Nathan said 8 months from contract signing, delivery complete by early summer. They asked about price. Nathan had thought carefully about his bid. He needed to make profit but also needed to win the contract. He offered $1,100 for the complete timber package, delivery included, all specifications guaranteed to be premium-grade larch. The committee members looked at each other. The chairman said they had one other bidder. Garrett Timber Company had submitted a proposal for $950 with delivery in 6 months. Nathan felt his chest tighten at the mention of Samuel's company. His brother was bidding against him, using the resources of the family operation that should have been half Nathan's, that would have been his if not for forgery and lies. Nathan asked what species Garrett Timber Company proposed to deliver. The chairman looked at the written bid and said the proposal specified Western larch throughout. Nathan chose his words carefully. He said the committee should request wood samples from both bidders before making a decision. Pine looked similar to larch when fresh cut, but behaved very differently over time. Pine rotted. Larch lasted. A church was meant to stand for generations. The species mattered more than the initial price. The committee seemed to appreciate this advice. They said they would request samples and make their decision within 2 weeks. Nathan left the church knowing Samuel would find a way to cheat. His brother would promise larch and deliver pine, would pocket the difference, would leave the church with a building that would begin rotting within a decade. The pattern was too familiar. Samuel always took the shortcut, always chose immediate profit over long-term integrity. 2 weeks later, the committee announced their decision. Garrett Timber Company had won the contract. Samuel's lower price and faster timeline had convinced them despite Nathan's warnings. Nathan learned the details from Margaret, who heard the news at the mill. Samuel had provided a sample of beautiful larch heartwood, had sworn the entire contract would be filled with timber of identical quality, had offered references from satisfied customers throughout the valley. Nathan knew the sample was a lie. Samuel would have bought premium larch from another source just to secure the contract, would deliver cheap pine for the actual construction, would hope the deception went unnoticed until years later when the rot became obvious. Nathan could have walked away, could have let Samuel's fraud play out, let the church discover the truth in its own time, but something in him would not accept that outcome. Perhaps it was respect for the church itself, for the congregation that worshiped there. Perhaps it was the desire to prevent Samuel from profiting through deception one more time. He went back to the building committee. He made an unusual offer: pay him nothing up front. He would deliver all timber to specification. The committee could inspect every piece, could have Margaret Lindstrom verify the species and grade the quality. If everything met specifications, if it was truly premium Western larch as promised, the committee would pay $1,100. If anything failed inspection, if Nathan delivered even a single piece of pine or substandard timber, the committee would pay nothing. The chairman asked why Nathan would take such a risk. Nathan said because he knew his timber was what he claimed it was, because he had nothing to hide and nothing to fear from inspection. He said the committee should ask Samuel to make the same guarantee. See if Garrett Timber Company would accept payment only after independent verification. The committee met privately for 20 minutes. When they returned, The chairman said they would give Nathan the contract under his proposed terms. They had canceled Garrett Timber Company's agreement. Zero risk to the church was an offer they could not refuse. Nathan walked out of that meeting knowing he had committed himself to the largest and most difficult harvest of his life. 300 logs minimum, all cut to exacting specifications, all delivered and milled to precise dimensions, all completed in 8 months during a Montana winter. He also knew Samuel would not forgive this interference. The competition had moved from passive resentment to active conflict. Nathan rode to the cabin of Lars Anderson, the Norwegian logger who had taught him river driving. He found Lars repairing an axe handle in the workshop behind his small house. Nathan explained what he had committed to, what he needed to accomplish. He asked if Lars and his wife Ingrid would work the winter season at Nathan's mountain camp. Lars listened without interrupting, his weathered face thoughtful. When Nathan finished, the old Norwegian asked 3 questions. What were the wages? Where would they sleep? What would they eat? Nathan offered $2 per day for Lars, $1.50 for Ingrid, plus room and board. He would build a bunkhouse before winter. Ingrid would manage the camp kitchen and also grade lumber quality, using her expert eye to sort timber into categories. Lars would help with cutting, bucking, and skidding logs to the chute. Lars looked at his wife. Ingrid was a solid woman in her early 50s, Swedish by birth, with hands that knew hard work and eyes that could assess timber as well as any man. She nodded once. Lars said they would come. They would arrive in October and work through until spring melt. Nathan spent September building. He chose a site 50 yards from his stone cabin, on a slight rise with good drainage. He felled lodgepole pines and hewed them into logs for wall construction. He built a structure 16 feet by 20, high enough for a man to stand upright at the ridge, with a door at one end and a window opening at the other. Inside, he constructed 2 bed platforms, a table and benches, shelves for storage. He built a separate cookhouse, smaller but with a proper firebox and chimney, storage for supplies, workspace for meal preparation. He built a tool shed with a roof to keep saws and axes dry. The work consumed every daylight hour. Nathan became intimately familiar with the rhythm of construction, the satisfaction of watching structures take shape from raw materials. His hands developed new calluses. His shoulders grew stronger from lifting and positioning logs. Lars and Ingrid arrived in early October, their possessions packed in a wagon, their faces showing the quiet determination of people who had worked hard camps before and knew what lay ahead. They looked at what Nathan had built and nodded approval. The bunkhouse was solid. The cookhouse was functional. The camp would serve. Ingrid took over food preparation immediately, cooking meals that were simple but substantial. Beans and salt pork, sourdough bread, strong coffee. She had learned to feed timber crews in the old country, knew how to make basic ingredients stretch, how to keep men fueled for the brutal physical labor of logging. Lars helped Nathan refine his systems. The old Norwegian had ideas about log handling that Nathan had not considered, techniques for positioning timber for cutting, methods for reducing waste and maximizing quality. They worked together easily, 2 men who understood wood and mountains and the satisfaction of work done well. November brought the first serious snows and the beginning of cutting. Nathan had mapped his harvest carefully, had marked trees that would yield the specific dimensions needed for the church contract. He, Lars, and occasionally Ingrid when an extra hand was needed, began the work of felling. A crosscut saw in the hands of 2 men could drop a tree in less time than 1 man working alone, but the work was still brutally hard. Each tree was a negotiation with gravity and wood grain and mountain terrain. Fall angles had to be calculated precisely. In steep country, A tree falling wrong could tumble down the mountain, could shatter against rocks, could kill the men cutting it. They worked through November and December, the temperature dropping to 20 below on the coldest nights. The camp routine became automatic. Wake in darkness, eat Ingrid's breakfast, hike to the cutting site, work until hands froze and bodies demanded rest, return to camp for the midday meal, work again until darkness made sawing dangerous, return for evening food and firelight and the maintenance of tools. Nathan learned that having partners transformed the work. Lars knew tricks for reading wood, for anticipating how a tree would behave when cut, for avoiding the dangers that killed less experienced loggers. Ingrid's presence meant hot food and organized supplies and someone to talk to besides himself. They cut through January and February, processing trees into logs, bucking them into the 16-foot lengths that would be standard for most of the church timber. The logs accumulated near the top of the natural chute, stacked in organized rows, marked with chalk to indicate their intended use. By late February, they had 285 logs ready. Nathan knew he would lose some to damage during descent and transport. He needed margin for error. March brought warming temperatures and the beginning of preparation for descent. Nathan and Lars reinforced the brake rails on the chute, added additional control features, tested the rope systems under load. Everything had to be perfect. A failure now would destroy months of work. April arrived with the snowmelt. The mountain transformed from white silence to the constant rush of water. Springs emerged from beneath the melting pack. The natural chute became a slick channel where meltwater ran in sheets over the granite. They began sending logs down. Nathan had refined his technique from the previous year. Each log was positioned carefully, released at controlled speed, guided into the chute at the precise angle that would keep it stable during descent. Lars stationed himself midway down to watch for problems. Ingrid waited at the bottom to inspect each log as it arrived. The work was dangerous and exhausting. They sent 10 to 15 logs per day, the maximum they could manage while maintaining safety standards. Nathan lost count of the close calls, the logs that nearly tumbled wrong, the moments when someone was almost in the wrong place when tons of wood came sliding past. They lost 20 logs to various failures. Some shattered despite the brake rails. Some tumbled out of the chute at points where the channel curved. But 265 logs reached the bottom intact. In early May, they faced the river drive. The Swan River ran high with snowmelt, cold and fast and dangerous. Nathan had hired 2 additional Norwegian loggers through Lars's network, men who knew river work and feared it with the healthy respect that kept loggers alive. The drive took 4 days instead of the 3 Nathan had planned. High water created unpredictable currents. Jams formed and had to be broken. On the 3rd day, Lars was nearly crushed when a jam released while he was working on top of it. He jumped clear at the last second, landing in water so cold it stopped breath. They pulled him out, built a fire on shore, wrapped him in dry blankets. Lars coughed up river water and grinned through chattering teeth and said that was his 3rd time in the Swan River, and he was hoping not to make it 4. 250 logs reached Flathead Lake and Margaret's Mill. Nathan stood on the dock as the last of the timber came floating in, feeling exhaustion in every muscle and joint. 4 months of cutting, weeks of descent operations, days of river driving. His entire body hurt. His hands were scarred and swollen. His face was weathered dark from sun reflecting off snow. But the timber was delivered. Margaret walked the floating logs, examining each one with the critical eye Nathan had come to respect. She marked certain logs for special milling, identified the best pieces for the primary structural timbers, segregated the wood that would become flooring versus wall boards. She told Nathan the quality was exceptional, better than the previous year's delivery. The selection was more uniform, the damage during transport minimal. She could mill this timber to the church specifications with confidence. Nathan asked if she would handle the milling personally. Margaret said she would. A contract this important required her direct attention. She would make sure every piece met the exact dimensions required, would inspect each timber before delivery. Over the next 6 weeks, Margaret transformed Nathan's logs into finished lumber. She worked the big circular saw herself, the blades screaming through larch heartwood, the sawdust falling in golden showers. She planed surfaces to smooth perfection. She cut mortises for joinery, beveled edges, created tongue and groove profiles for the flooring boards. Nathan visited the mill several times during the milling process, watching Margaret work. She handled timber with absolute confidence, reading grain patterns, adjusting cuts to avoid defects, maximizing yield from each log. Her skill was obvious in every piece she produced. She also talked while she worked, explaining what she was doing, why certain cuts were made at particular angles, how wood behavior changed with moisture content and temperature. Nathan realized she was teaching him, sharing knowledge the way Lars had shared knowledge about river driving. Something was growing between them, had been growing since that first timber delivery, deepening with each interaction. They were both independent, both skilled in their respective crafts, both survivors of losses that had forced them to become stronger. Margaret's husband had drowned doing the same dangerous work Nathan now did every spring. She understood the risks, understood the commitment required. But neither spoke of what was developing. The work came first. The church contract demanded completion. In early July, Margaret delivered the finished timber to the church construction site. 60 major structural timbers, 8 by 8 and 6 by 12, lengths ranging from 16 to 20 feet. 240 boards for walls and flooring, all tongue and groove, all planed smooth. Everything precisely to specification, every piece premium Western larch heartwood. The building committee inspected the delivery. They measured dimensions, checked for defects, verified species. Margaret stood by with documentation showing which logs had produced which timbers, proving chain of custody from Nathan's mountain to the mill to the construction site. The chairman ran his hand over one of the major timbers, feeling the straight grain, seeing the beautiful color of the larch heartwood. He said this was the finest building material he had seen in Montana territory. He said the church would stand for generations. The committee paid Nathan $1,100. After expenses for Lars and Ingrid's wages, for the additional river drivers, for supplies and equipment, Nathan netted $720 profit. More importantly, everyone in Kalispell could now see the timber. The church construction became a showcase for Nathan's larch. People stopped to admire the huge timbers, the beautiful grain, the quality of the milling. Word spread through the valley. The hermit on the mountain who logged impossible terrain and produced premium lumber became a known quantity, a reliable contractor. 3 days after the church payment, Nathan received an official notice from the county assessor. His mountain property had been re-evaluated for tax purposes. The new assessment valued the land at 15 times its previous figure. Annual taxes would increase from $8 to $120. Nathan rode to the county offices to contest the assessment. The assessor was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, someone who dealt in paper rather than timber. He showed Nathan the justification for the increase. The successful logging operation proved the land had significant commercial value. The church contract demonstrated substantial income generation. The property clearly was not the worthless vertical terrain described in the original deed. Nathan explained that the value came from his knowledge and labor, not from the land itself. Anyone else attempting to log that property would find it exactly as worthless as the deed claimed. The terrain was too steep for conventional methods. Without Nathan's specific skills and systems, without the natural chute and the control structures he had built, the timber was inaccessible. The assessor said that was irrelevant. The land was producing income, therefore it had taxable value. Nathan asked if the assessor would like to visit the property, to see for himself why conventional logging was impossible. The assessor declined. He said his decision was based on documented facts. The assessment would stand unless Nathan could provide evidence that the land valuation was incorrect. Nathan hired a surveyor to produce detailed maps showing slope angles, terrain obstacles, the absence of conventional access routes. He gathered affidavits from other loggers stating that the property could not be harvested using standard methods. He documented his costs for building the control systems that made logging possible. The process took weeks and cost money Nathan would have preferred to save. But eventually, the assessor agreed to a compromise. The valuation would increase to 5 times the original rather than 15 times. Annual taxes would be $45 instead of $120. Nathan paid the first installment and knew with absolute certainty that Samuel was behind the reassessment. His brother had connections throughout the territorial government, had spent years building relationships with officials. This was retaliation for Nathan winning the church contract, for interfering with Samuel's plans. It would not be the last attack. Samuel's pride would not allow Nathan's success to go unchallenged. Nathan returned to his mountain with the satisfaction of the church contract and the knowledge that Samuel was watching, waiting for opportunities to undermine what Nathan was building. The conflict between them had moved beyond simple betrayal into ongoing warfare, fought through legal mechanisms and bureaucratic processes. But Nathan had advantages Samuel did not fully understand. Nathan had learned to survive with nothing, had built systems from raw materials and determination, had found partners who valued skill and integrity over political connections. Margaret, Lars, Ingrid, the Norwegian river drivers, the mill workers who processed his timber. These relationships were genuine, built on mutual respect and shared labor. Samuel had money and influence and the family company, but he was building on a foundation of lies, and lies eventually revealed themselves. Nathan stood outside his stone cabin on an August evening, looking down at the valley where Kalispell's lights were beginning to appear in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down there, Samuel lived in comfort, slept in the house their father built, ran the company their grandfather started. But up here on the mountain, Nathan owned something Samuel would never possess. The knowledge that every dollar he earned came from honest work. The confidence that his reputation was built on skill rather than deception. The satisfaction of taking worthless land and transforming it into productive value through intelligence and relentless effort. Autumn arrived with the golden turning of the larch needles. Nathan prepared for another winter harvest, already planning next year's operations. Lars and Ingrid would return in October. The logging camp was ready. The systems were refined and tested. Margaret had customers asking specifically for Nathan's larch, willing to pay premium prices for timber they knew would last. The mountain that was supposed to be Nathan's punishment had become his advantage. The isolation that was meant to break him had made him stronger, and the brother who had betrayed him was watching Nathan's success grow, knowing that every log that came down the mountain was proof that Samuel's calculations had been catastrophically wrong. Nathan had taken worthless land and made it valuable. He had turned betrayal into opportunity, and he was only beginning to build what would eventually prove unshakable. The church timber stood in the valley below, massive larch timbers rising toward the Montana sky, a monument to quality and permanence, and the truth that value comes from craftsmanship rather than shortcuts. Every time Samuel saw that church, he would be reminded that Nathan had won the contract Samuel tried to steal, had delivered quality Samuel would have faked, had built a reputation Samuel could never match through political connections alone. Nathan went inside his stone cabin, built up the fire, made coffee in the dented pot he had carried up the mountain that first winter. He sat at the table he had built with his own hands and opened his notebook to plan next year's harvest. Outside, the mountain stood silent in the gathering darkness, its slopes covered with large trees that would produce timber for decades if managed wisely. The natural chute waited for next spring's logs. The control system stood ready. Everything Nathan needed was here. The land that everyone said was worthless, the knowledge he had earned through trial and failure, the partners who had proven themselves reliable, the market that valued quality over price. Samuel had given him this mountain thinking it was nothing, but Nathan had discovered something his brother would never understand. That worthless land in the right hands, with the right knowledge and the right determination, could become more valuable than inheritance ever was. Because inheritance could be stolen with forged documents. But what a man built himself, through his own labor and skill and refusal to quit, that could never be taken away. The years 1892 and 1893 brought growth that Nathan had not anticipated when he first stood in that worthless mountain tract wondering how he would survive. The church contract had established his reputation throughout the Flathead Valley and beyond. Contractors building barns wanted his larch for frames, willing to pay premium prices for timber they knew would outlast their own lifetimes. Railroad construction supervisors requested timbers for bridge abutments, specifying western larch, because it could bear tremendous weight while resisting the rot that destroyed lesser wood in just a few years. A mining company operating in the mountains east of Kalispell needed supports for shaft construction, and specified western larch exclusively for its rot resistance in the perpetually damp underground conditions where pine or fir would fail within seasons. Each contract built on the previous one, each satisfied customer became a reference for the next job. Each successful delivery added another layer to Nathan's growing reputation as a logger who understood both timber and commitment. Word spread through the territorial construction industry. If you needed quality that would last, if you needed delivery on schedule, if you needed someone who would not substitute cheap wood and hope you did not notice until years later when rot appeared, you contracted with Garrett Mountain Timber. Nathan hired 2 additional Norwegian loggers in the fall of 1892, men who had worked with Lars in the old country and understood mountain timber in ways that went beyond simple cutting. Eric and Olaf were brothers, both in their 30s, both built like draft horses with the endurance to match and the temperament that made them reliable partners in dangerous work. They arrived at the mountain camp with their own tools, crosscut saws that showed years of careful maintenance, axes with handles shaped to their individual grips, peavies worn smooth from use. They brought years of experience cutting timber in Norwegian terrain that made Nathan's slopes look gentle by comparison, mountains where 40-degree angles were considered easy ground, and where loggers routinely worked pitches that would terrify American timber crews. They worked for wages and asked no questions about why a man would choose to live alone on a mountain that everyone said was worthless. They understood that every logger had his own reasons for being where he was, that the mountains attracted men who valued solitude and hard work over the complications of settled society. They were professional in the best sense, showed up on time, worked without complaint, demonstrated skills that immediately made the operation more efficient. The logging camp expanded to accommodate them. Nathan built another bunkhouse, larger than the first, with space for 6 men and a massive wood stove that could heat the interior even when outside temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. He used larch for the structural timbers, knowing the building would still be standing 50 years hence when lesser wood had rotted away. He expanded the cookhouse, adding storage for the increased supplies needed to feed a crew through winter, building shelves and bins for the hundreds of pounds of beans and flour, and salt pork required to keep working men fueled through months of brutal labor in brutal cold. Ingrid managed the cooking operation with fierce Swedish efficiency, producing meals that were simple but substantial, the kind of food that kept men fueled for physical labor that consumed 5,000 calories per day. She baked bread in a Dutch oven, great heavy loaves that came out crusty and dense, and still warm when the men gathered for breakfast at 5 in the morning. She made stews that simmered all day on the cookhouse stove, adding whatever meat the hunters brought in, stretching ingredients through knowledge and skill. She rationed the coffee carefully, knowing it was expensive and had to last until the next supply run down the mountain, but always made sure there was enough for men who needed it to start their day. The operation took on a rhythm that felt almost industrial despite the primitive methods. Trees fell in carefully calculated patterns, each one positioned to avoid damaging standing timber or creating hazards during descent. Crosscut saws rang through the forest in harmony, 2 men on each saw, the blades moving in coordinated rhythm that spoke of years working together, of partnerships where each man knew exactly when to pull and when to push, when to bear down and when to ease up. The sound carried through the mountain forest like music, like some strange industrial symphony performed by men and steel and wood. Logs accumulated near the natural chute, stacked in organized rows according to dimension and intended use, marked with chalk to indicate whether they would become timbers or boards, whether they were destined for railroad bridges or barn frames or mine shafts. The camp hummed with purposeful activity from first light until dark, the sounds of axes and saws and men's voices calling warnings echoing off the mountain face, creating an atmosphere of focused productivity that Nathan found deeply satisfying. Nathan had become not just a logger but a manager, coordinating the work of multiple men, planning harvests weeks in advance, calculating yields and costs and profit margins. He kept detailed records in his notebook, tracking which trees produced which yields, which techniques worked best in different conditions, which customers paid promptly, and which required reminders. The work was different from the physical labor he had done alone that first winter, but equally demanding in its own way. Margaret visited the camp twice that first winter, riding up through snow that was sometimes 4 feet deep on the trail. She came ostensibly to inspect timber quality, to verify that Nathan's expanded operation maintained the standards she required. But Nathan suspected she also came to see him, to maintain the connection that had been growing between them through 2 years of working together. They walked through the timber stands together, discussing which trees to harvest, which to leave for future years. Margaret had an eye for quality that rivaled Lars's experience, could read grain patterns in standing timber, could predict how a tree would mill before it was ever cut. She suggested modifications to Nathan's harvesting plan, pointed out trees he had overlooked, identified problems he had not recognized. The advice was valuable, but Nathan found himself treasuring these visits for reasons that had nothing to do with timber. Margaret's presence brought warmth to the mountain that had nothing to do with the fires burning in the camp stoves. When she laughed at something Lars said, when she examined a fresh-cut log and nodded approval, when she sat across from Nathan at the rough plank table planning next season's deliveries, Nathan felt less alone than he had since his father's death. But neither of them spoke of what was developing. Montana Territory was not a place where unmarried men and women could openly acknowledge attraction without risking reputation. Margaret was a widow trying to maintain respect, while running a business in a male-dominated industry. Nathan was still building his operation, still proving himself, still too focused on survival to consider anything beyond the immediate demands of work. So they maintained careful distance even as something unspoken grew between them. They discussed timber and markets and contracts. They made plans for spring deliveries and negotiated prices and debated the merits of different milling techniques. And underneath all of that, something else flourished in silence. The spring drives of 1893 and 1894 delivered 400 logs each year to Margaret's mill. Nathan's income climbed steadily. He was earning $2,000 to $2,500 per year now, more money than his father had ever made from the family timber company. He saved most of it, living simply, reinvesting in equipment and improvements. The bank account grew, representing security and options and the slow accumulation of genuine wealth. But Samuel noticed. Samuel had eyes throughout the valley, had connections who reported on Nathan's activities. The church stood in the center of Kalispell, its large timbers visible to everyone who passed, a constant reminder that Nathan had won a contract Samuel tried to steal. Contractors talked about the quality of Garrett mountain timber, about the reliability of deliveries, about the premium they willingly paid for lumber they knew would last. Samuel's attacks became more frequent and more sophisticated. In early 1893, a lawyer appeared at Nathan's mountain camp with documents claiming the original deed to the tract was defective, that their father had never properly owned the land, that the transfer to Samuel and then to Nathan was therefore invalid. The claim was baseless, built on deliberately misread survey records and creative interpretation of territorial law. Nathan hired Samuel Porter, an attorney in Kalispell who had practiced for 30 years and knew property law as thoroughly as Nathan knew timber. Porter examined every document in the chain of ownership, traced the title back through 3 previous owners to the original homestead claim, assembled a file of evidence that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Nathan's ownership was legitimate and unassailable. The opposing lawyer withdrew the claim when Porter threatened to file a counter-suit for malicious prosecution and to seek damages for the time and money Nathan had spent defending against frivolous litigation. But the attack had cost Nathan $200 in legal fees and weeks of worry, exactly as Samuel had intended. Then came the rumors. Word spread through the valley that Nathan's logging methods were unsafe, that he pushed his men too hard, that accidents were inevitable given the extreme slopes and primitive equipment. The rumors were lies. Nathan ran the safest operation in Montana territory, had trained his men in techniques that minimized risk, had never had a serious injury in 3 years of logging. But rumors damaged reputation regardless of truth. 2 potential contracts fell through when customers chose other suppliers, citing concerns about Nathan's methods. Margaret traced the rumors back to loggers who worked for Samuel's company, men who were repeating stories they had been paid to spread. Nathan could have confronted Samuel directly, but he knew that would accomplish nothing. His brother operated through intermediaries and legal mechanisms, never exposed himself to direct accountability. So Nathan fought back the only way available. He invited customers to visit the mountain operation, to see his methods firsthand, to judge safety for themselves. 3 contractors made the difficult ride up the mountain. They watched Nathan's crew work, saw the careful planning that went into each tree felling, observed the safety procedures and the quality control measures. All 3 left impressed, and all 3 placed contracts. Word spread that the rumors were false, that Nathan ran a professional operation. The damage Samuel tried to inflict reversed itself. In the summer of 1893, Samuel attempted something more direct. He approached Margaret with an offer to buy the Lindstrom sawmill. He offered $12,000, substantially more than the mill's assessed value. Margaret would retain a management position if she wished, would continue running operations while Samuel provided capital for expansion. Margaret refused without hesitation. She knew the offer was designed to cut Nathan off from his primary customer, to force him to either accept unfavorable terms from other mills or cease operations entirely. She told Samuel that the mill was not for sale at any price, that she valued her independence and her business relationships, that she had no interest in partnerships with men whose reputations were built on questionable dealing. Samuel's response came within a week. The county suddenly questioned whether Margaret's mill was properly licensed, whether she had the legal authority to operate as a woman without a male business partner, whether her accounts were properly audited. Each challenge required time and money to answer, required lawyers and paperwork and appearances before county officials. Margaret fought back with the same stubborn determination Nathan had developed. She hired attorneys, produced documentation, attended every hearing. The county eventually admitted all licensing was in order, all regulations met, all questions answered satisfactorily. But the harassment had achieved its purpose, had cost Margaret time and money and emotional energy, had demonstrated that opposing Samuel carried consequences. Nathan and Margaret discussed the situation one evening at her mill office, sitting across from each other at a desk covered with invoices and correspondence. Nathan said he was sorry his conflict with Samuel was spilling over onto her, that she was being attacked because of her business relationship with him. Margaret looked at him with the direct gaze he had come to know well. She said she was capable of managing her own conflicts, that she chose her business partners based on quality and integrity, that she would not be intimidated by threats or inconvenience. She said if Samuel thought he could drive a wedge between them through harassment, he had badly miscalculated. Something shifted in that moment, some unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. They were partners now in more than just business, were allies facing common threats, were two people who had found in each other something rare and valuable. The words remained unspoken, but the understanding was clear. Then came August of 1894, and the fire that would reshape everything. The summer had been brutally dry, the kind of drought that left the entire territory tinder-ready and waiting for ignition. No rain fell through June. July brought temperatures that climbed past 100 degrees day after day, the sun beating down from cloudless skies, baking moisture from soil and vegetation alike. The mountain grasses turned brown and brittle, crackling underfoot when walked on. Small creeks that normally ran year-round dried to dusty channels lined with stones that had not seen sunlight in decades. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the spark that everyone knew would eventually come, that came every few years, that was as inevitable as winter snow. Lightning struck somewhere in the Flathead National Forest on August 10th. Nathan saw the smoke from his cabin the next morning, a dark smudge on the eastern horizon 30 miles distant, small enough to ignore if you did not know what you were seeing. But Nathan knew. Every logger in Montana Territory knew that particular color of smoke, knew what it meant when columns rose from forest land during drought conditions. By afternoon, the smoke had grown into a towering column visible across half the territory, rising thousands of feet into the air, spreading at altitude into a mushroom shape that blocked the sun. By evening, the western sky glowed orange with reflected fire, the light pulsing and shifting as the flames below fed on forest that had been growing for centuries. The fire spread with terrifying speed driven by drought conditions and high winds that pushed flames through stands of lodgepole pine like a liquid wave, consuming everything in its path. The pines exploded when the fire reached them, pitch pockets superheating and bursting, throwing sparks hundreds of yards ahead of the main fire, creating new ignition points that merged back into the advancing wall of flame. Nathan stood outside his cabin at midnight watching the sky pulse with light like some terrible dawn occurring in the wrong direction, smelling smoke on the wind that had shifted to blow from the east, bringing with it the scent of burning pine and fir, and the underlying smell of burning earth itself. By the third day, the fire had consumed 50,000 acres and showed no signs of slowing or turning. It was moving west in a front that stretched for miles, consuming everything combustible, leaving behind a landscape of ash and blackened stumps and smoking earth. Nathan could track its progress by the smoke, by the reports that came up from the valley, by the increasing thickness of ash that fell like gray snow on his camp. He had perhaps 2 days, maybe 3 at most, before the fire reached his property boundary. The decision was simple in theory, agonizing in practice and consequence. He could evacuate, save himself and his crew, abandon the timber and the camp and everything he had built over 4 brutal years of labor. The men would survive. The equipment could be replaced eventually. The buildings could be reconstructed. But the larch groves, the premium old-growth timber that made his operation viable, those trees had been growing for 200 years and would take 200 more to replace. If they burned, his operation was finished. Or he could try to save it, could attempt to create fire breaks that might protect at least some of his timber, could gamble everything on techniques that sometimes worked and sometimes failed, could risk lives including his own on the possibility that human effort could redirect or slow a natural force that had already consumed 50,000 acres. Lars and the other loggers voted to stay and fight when Nathan gave them the choice. These were men who had faced forest fires before in Norway and Sweden, who knew the risks with absolute clarity but also knew the techniques that sometimes worked, that occasionally succeeded in saving what seemed doomed. They could not stop the fire. No human force could stop what had grown to this size. But they might be able to direct it, might be able to create conditions that would cause the fire to move around rather than through Nathan's most valuable timber. They spent 2 days cutting fire breaks with intensity that bordered on desperation, working 18-hour shifts with only brief breaks for food and water. They felled every tree in 200-foot wide strips running perpendicular to the fire's anticipated path, creating gaps the fire might not cross if conditions were right, if the wind held steady, if luck favored them. They cleared away brush and deadfall that could carry flames across the gaps, raking the ground down to mineral soil in some places. They soaked the ground with water carried in buckets from the spring, dozens of men making hundreds of trips, trying to create moisture barriers that might slow the fire's advance through underground root systems. The work was exhausting beyond anything Nathan had experienced, was labor that left hands bleeding and backs screaming, was effort that continued from first light until darkness made sawing impossible. The fire arrived on the evening of August 18th. Nathan stood at the edge of his highest fire break, watching the wall of flame approach through the forest below. The sound was like a freight train, a continuous roar punctuated by explosions as pitch pockets in pine trees superheated and burst. The heat was intense even at 200 yards distance, a physical pressure that dried eyes and made breathing difficult. The fire reached the first fire break and hesitated. For 10 minutes it burned along the cleared strip, finding insufficient fuel to maintain its forward momentum at that point. Then the wind shifted slightly, blowing from the south instead of due east. The fire curved around Nathan's tract, following the new wind direction, seeking the path of least resistance through uncut forest. Nathan watched in disbelief as the fire passed within half a mile of his camp, close enough that ash fell like snow, close enough that sparks drifted on the wind and had to be stamped out where they landed. But the fire breaks held. The cleared zones created just enough disruption in the fire's fuel supply, just enough of a gap combined with the wind shift, that the flames found easier paths elsewhere. The fire continued east through the Swan Valley, consuming everything in its path. Nathan stood at his cabin at midnight, looking down at the valley below where dozens of individual fires glowed like malevolent stars, where entire mountainsides burned, where the future of the timber industry in northwestern Montana was being rewritten in flame and smoke. And somewhere down there, Garrett Timber Company land was burning. The 1,800 acres that had been in Nathan's family for 3 generations, the property Samuel had stolen with forged documents, the timber stands that represented the foundation of Samuel's business operations. All of it lay directly in the fire's path. Nathan learned the details over the following week. The fire had swept through Garrett Company land like divine judgment, consuming decades of old-growth timber, leaving behind a moonscape of ash and blackened stumps. The loss was estimated at $80,000, nearly twice what the entire company was worth including land and equipment. Samuel's primary asset had been reduced to charcoal. The fire burned for another week before rain finally arrived and extinguished what remained. By then, more than 120,000 acres had burned across 3 counties. Dozens of timber operations had been destroyed. Several small mills had burned to the ground. The economic impact would be felt for years. But Nathan's mountain tract stood virtually untouched. A few acres on the eastern boundary showed fire damage, but the fire breaks had saved the rest. His larch groves remained intact. His camp building stood unburned. His equipment and supplies had survived. While the valley below assessed catastrophic losses, Nathan had emerged with everything he had risked to save. September brought Samuel to the mountain for the 3rd time in 6 years. Nathan was working at the camp when Lars came to tell him a rider was approaching. Nathan walked down the trail to meet whoever was coming, expecting a customer or perhaps a territorial official assessing fire damage. Instead, he found his brother. Samuel looked diminished in ways that went beyond the obvious physical changes. He had lost weight, his face gaunt where it had been full. His clothes were plain and dusty from the trail, no longer the expensive suits he had favored. He rode alone on a horse that showed signs of hard use and inadequate care. But the real change was in his bearing, in the absence of the confidence that had always characterized him, the certainty that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage. Samuel dismounted stiffly, moving like a man older than his 34 years. He stood looking at Nathan for a long moment, and in that silence was everything that had happened between them, everything that could not be undone or forgotten. Nathan waited. He would not make this easier with pleasantries or premature questions. Samuel had come here for a reason. Let him state it. Finally Samuel spoke, his voice rough as if he had not used it much recently. The fire took everything. 1,800 acres burned to ash. The standing timber that secured the company's loans is gone. The bank is calling the notes. I have debts totaling $25,000 and no way to pay them. Foreclosure proceedings begin next month. Nathan stood with his arms crossed, his face showing nothing. He had imagined this moment during the dark nights after Samuel's betrayal, had fantasized about his brother brought low, about seeing Samuel beg. Now that the moment had arrived, Nathan felt no satisfaction, only a kind of weary inevitability. Samuel continued, I know what I did to you. I know the promissory note was forged. I know the witnesses lied because I paid them to lie. I know you have every reason to refuse what I'm asking, but we are brothers. Father would want us to help each other. Nathan's voice when he finally spoke was cold and level. Do not talk about what Father would want. You dishonored his memory the day you forged my signature and stole my inheritance. Samuel flinched but did not look away. Yes, I did. I thought I was smarter than you. I thought education and connections were worth more than your practical skills. I thought the mountain land was worthless and I was giving you nothing while keeping everything of value. I was wrong about all of it." The admission surprised Nathan more than any lie could have. Samuel had never acknowledged error, had always found ways to justify his actions, to shift blame, to reframe circumstances in his favor. But this was different. This was genuine recognition of failure, perhaps even genuine remorse. Nathan asked the question that mattered: "What do you want from me?" Samuel took a breath as if steadying himself. "A loan. $5,000 to pay the most pressing debts, to buy time with the bank, to keep the company from immediate collapse. I will sign papers, pay interest, whatever terms you require. I just need help to survive this crisis." Nathan looked at his brother, at this man who had taken everything Nathan thought he needed and left him with land everyone considered worthless. He thought about the stone cabin and the first brutal winter. He thought about learning to log impossible terrain, about building systems from nothing, about transforming worthless into valuable through knowledge and determination. He thought about Margaret and Lars and Ingrid and Eric and Olaf, about the people who had helped him not because of family obligation, but because they recognized worth in him and in his work. He thought about the reputation he had built through quality and integrity, about customers who sought him out, about the church standing in Kalispell with timbers that would last a century. He had built something real, something earned, something that could not be stolen or destroyed because it existed in his knowledge and his character as much as in timber and accounts. Nathan's response was deliberate and final. "I do not want to loan you money. I want the timber company land. What is left of it?" Samuel's face showed confusion. "The burned land. It is worthless now. It will not produce timber for 30 or 40 years. You would be buying ash and stumps." Nathan nodded slowly. "Everything you gave me was worthless too. Everyone told me the mountain tract could not be logged. You gave it to me thinking it was punishment, thinking you were taking everything and leaving me with nothing. But I made it valuable. I found a way when everyone said there was no way." He stepped closer to Samuel, close enough to see the exhaustion in his brother's eyes, close enough to speak quietly and be heard clearly. "You took Father's legacy with lies. I will buy it back with honest money I earned from the worthless mountain you threw away. Sign over the company land, all 1,800 acres, and I will pay your debts. $25,000. You walk away clear." Samuel stared at him. "That is more than the land is worth in its current state. That is charity disguised as business." Nathan shook his head. "It is justice. You get to escape the consequences of your own greed. I get back what should have been mine from the beginning. We both get what we deserve." Samuel stood silent for a long time, looking down at the valley where smoke still rose from the burned districts, where his company land lay devastated, where his future had disappeared in flame. When he looked back at Nathan, something in his expression had changed. Acceptance, perhaps, or simply recognition that he had no other options. He asked when Nathan wanted to complete the transfer. Nathan said they would go to Kalispell tomorrow, would handle all the legal work properly, would ensure the transfer was documented beyond any possibility of dispute. He would pay Samuel's debts directly to the creditors, would not give Samuel cash that might disappear. Everything would be done through lawyers and banks and official channels. Samuel nodded. He asked if he could stay the night at the camp. Nathan pointed to the bunkhouse where the loggers slept. "You can stay there. Dinner is at 6. That evening, Samuel sat at the plank table in the cookhouse, eating Ingrid's simple but substantial meal alongside the Norwegian loggers. Nathan watched his brother move awkwardly among working men, uncomfortable with the rough benches and plain food and absence of deference. This was Samuel's first time seeing how Nathan had been living, Seeing the primitive conditions and hard work that had built the success, Samuel could not help but notice. After dinner, Nathan and Samuel walked to the edge of the camp, looking down at the darkening valley below. Samuel asked how Nathan had survived that first winter alone, how he had figured out the logging system, how he had built all of this from nothing. Nathan described it simply, one day at a time, one problem at a time, no choice except to solve it or fail. Samuel said he envied Nathan. The statement was so unexpected that Nathan turned to look at his brother's face, trying to determine if this was manipulation or truth. Samuel continued, "You took nothing and made everything. I took everything and made nothing. You built something that cannot be stolen or destroyed because it exists in what you know and who you are. I built on lies and shortcuts and it all burned. Father would be proud of one son at least." Nathan had no response to this. The words sounded genuine, but trust was not something he could extend easily, not after what Samuel had done. They stood in silence as night fell completely, as the stars emerged overhead, as the mountain settled into its evening quiet. The next morning they rode down to Kalispell together. The lawyers and bankers who handled the transaction looked at them with barely concealed curiosity. Two brothers with such obvious physical resemblance conducting business with such careful formality. Nathan paid $25,000 from his bank account, the accumulation of 3 years of brutal labor and careful saving, watching the balance drop to near nothing. But he received in return the deed to Garrett Timber Company land, 1,800 acres that his grandfather had claimed, his father had worked, and his brother had stolen. The land was burned and would not produce timber for decades, but it was back in Nathan's possession, secured through legitimate transaction, documented beyond dispute. Samuel signed the papers with a hand that trembled slightly. When everything was finished, when the lawyers had witnessed and notarized every document, when the transaction was complete and irrevocable, Samuel stood to leave. He looked at Nathan one final time. "I am going to Seattle. There is nothing left for me here. We will probably not see each other again." Nathan nodded. "That is probably best." Samuel paused at the door. "For what it is worth, I am sorry. I know that changes nothing, but I want you to know I recognize what I did was wrong." Nathan watched his brother walk out of the lawyer's office into the bright November sunlight. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Samuel's defeat, only a kind of closure, a sense that this chapter had finally ended in the only way it could have ended. He rode to Margaret's mill that afternoon. She was in her office, working through correspondence, and she looked up with surprise when Nathan appeared in the doorway. He told her what had happened, about the fire and Samuel's return and the offer Nathan had made, about the transfer of the family land, about spending his entire savings to reclaim what had been stolen. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Nathan finished, she asked what he planned to do with burned land that would not produce for decades. Nathan said he had been thinking about that. The land was good agricultural country, had water access and gentle slopes perfect for farming or ranching. It could support families who wanted to homestead, who needed opportunity more than they needed cleared forest. He was thinking about dividing the land into parcels, selling them to immigrants and freedmen and young families at prices they could afford with payment plans they could manage. Let the land support people who would work it honestly, who would build homes and communities and futures. Margaret smiled, the expression lighting her face in ways that made Nathan's chest tighten. She said that was typical of him, to take something most men would see as a burden and find a way to make it serve a larger purpose. She said something else too, that she admired how Nathan had handled Samuel, that he could have chosen vengeance but chose justice instead, could have refused help but provided a path forward even for someone who deserved no mercy. That kind of character was rare. Nathan felt heat rise in his face. He was not accustomed to such direct praise, to having his decisions evaluated and approved by someone whose opinion he valued so deeply. He changed the subject, asking about lumber orders, about mill capacity, about practical matters that felt safer than the emotional territory they were approaching. But something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that they were moving toward something neither had yet named. Margaret walked him to the door when he prepared to leave, and their hands touched briefly as he took his coat. The contact lasted only a second, but it carried weight beyond its duration. Nathan rode back up the mountain as evening fell. He passed through Kalispell and saw the church standing solid and beautiful, its larch timbers glowing golden in the last light. He saw families walking the streets, saw businesses closing for the day, saw the ordinary life of a small Montana town proceeding as it always did. But everything had changed for Nathan. He now owned 1,940 acres, counting his mountain tract and the family land. He had proven his systems worked, had established a reputation for quality, had built a profitable operation from nothing. He had faced his brother and reclaimed what was stolen. He had found partners who valued competence over connections, integrity over manipulation. And he had found in Margaret someone who understood him, who respected his work, who saw value in his approach to both timber and life. They had not yet spoken of what was growing between them, but the acknowledgement was coming. Time would bring it to the surface in its own way. Nathan reached his cabin as full darkness arrived. He built up the fire and made coffee, and sat at his table looking at the deed to the family land. His grandfather's homestead claim signature was at the bottom of the chain of ownership documents. His father's name appeared in the transfer to the next generation. And now Nathan's name, reclaiming what should have been his from the beginning. The cabin walls were stone, solid and permanent, built by people long gone but still providing shelter. The table was larch he had cut and milled himself. The fire was wood he had split with his own hands. Everything here represented work and knowledge and determination. Samuel was gone to Seattle, carrying with him the consequences of his own choices. The family land was burned but would recover, would grow new timber that Nathan's children or grandchildren might harvest. The mountain stood unchanged, still producing premium larch, still generating value that everyone had said was impossible. Nathan sat in his stone cabin and felt something he had not felt since his father's death. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the solid satisfaction of a man who has faced his trials and emerged stronger, who has lost everything and rebuilt better, who has discovered that the only inheritance that truly matters is the one you create yourself through the choices you make, and the character you demonstrate when those choices become difficult. The worthless mountain had taught him well, had taught him that value is not given but created, that what matters is not what you inherit but what you build, that betrayal can destroy what you have but cannot touch who you are. And who Nathan was, sitting in his stone cabin at 5,000 feet with 1,900 acres of Montana territory in his name, and knowledge earned through the hardest possible education, that was someone Samuel could never steal, no matter how many documents he forged. Nathan rode across the burned land in late November, his horse picking carefully through ash and blackened stumps that stretched in every direction. The fire had transformed 1,800 acres of forest into a landscape that looked like the surface of a dead planet, gray and lifeless under a sky that seemed too bright without the filter of trees. The smell of char hung in the air despite the weeks that had passed since the flames died, a bitter scent that coated the back of the throat and lingered in clothing. But Nathan was not seeing devastation. He was seeing possibility. The land itself was good. The fire had burned hot enough to consume trees and brush, but not so hot that it sterilized the soil. Already he could see green shoots emerging in places where ash had been washed away by rain, native grasses beginning their reclamation of the burned ground. The topography was gentle compared to his mountain tract, slopes that averaged 10 to 15 degrees, easy terrain for farming or ranching. Water access was excellent with 3 year-round creeks running through the property. The location was central, close enough to Kalispell for market access, but far enough out for land prices to be affordable. This land had supported his grandfather's homestead, had produced enough to raise a family and build the foundation of a timber company. It could do so again, but not for Nathan. He had his mountain operation, had systems and markets and a business that worked. He did not need this land for himself. But he knew people who did. Montana Territory in 1894 was full of families looking for opportunity. Immigrants from Scandinavia and Germany seeking farmland they could afford. Freedmen from the South hoping to escape the violence and oppression that made life there increasingly untenable. Young couples starting out who needed a stake but lacked capital. All of them willing to work. All of them capable of transforming raw land into productive homesteads if given the chance. Nathan spent December developing his plan. He had the burned land surveyed and divided into 12 parcels of 150 acres each, sizes large enough to support a family farm or small ranch, but not so large that clearing and development would be overwhelming. He had a lawyer in Kalispell draw up contracts that were clear and fair, that specified terms anyone could understand. $500 per parcel, payable over 10 years at $50 per year with no interest charged. First payment due 1 year after signing, giving families time to establish themselves before money came due. The terms were generous to the point that the lawyer questioned whether Nathan understood the economics. At those prices and terms, Nathan would recover only $6,000 from land he had paid $25,000 to acquire. He would be taking a substantial loss. Nathan understood perfectly. He was not trying to maximize profit. He was trying to create opportunity for people who needed it while reclaiming land that his grandfather had cleared, his father had worked, and his brother had stolen. The land would be productive again, would support families who would work it honestly, who would build homes and futures on ground his ancestors had claimed. That outcome was worth more than any profit calculation. He began recruiting families in January of 1895, placing notices in immigrant community newspapers, speaking with ministers who served freedmen congregations, visiting settlements where people gathered who were looking for their chance. Word spread through networks built on shared experience and common struggle, through the connections that formed between people who understood what it meant to start over with nothing, to rebuild after loss, to hope for opportunities that seemed impossibly distant. Nathan interviewed each applicant carefully in his office at Margaret's Mill, sitting across a scarred wooden desk, asking questions designed not to judge their worthiness, but to ensure they understood what they were taking on. Clearing burned land was brutal work that would consume their first year and possibly their second. Building a homestead from nothing required determination and endurance that went beyond simple willingness. The first years would be hard beyond anything most of them had experienced, would test their marriages and their health, and their commitment in ways they could not anticipate sitting in the relative comfort of the mill office. But for those willing to accept the challenge, Nathan offered something rare in Montana Territory and rarer still in the wider American economy of 1895. Land they could actually afford on terms that gave them room to succeed rather than setting them up for inevitable failure and foreclosure. No bank would make loans on terms this generous. No land speculator would sell at prices this reasonable. But Nathan was not trying to maximize profit. He was trying to honor his grandfather's legacy and create something his brother's greed had destroyed. The first family to sign was Swedish, the Andersons, a couple in their late 20s with two small children who had survived the passage from the old country and 3 hard years in Kalispell. Carl Anderson had worked as a laborer, first in the lumber mills and then in construction, saving every penny with the discipline that characterized immigrants who understood opportunity was finite and had to be seized when it appeared. His wife Elsa was practical and strong in the way of Scandinavian farm women, the kind of person who could birth a baby in the morning and be back working by afternoon, who could stretch food to feed unexpected guests, who could turn scraps of cloth into serviceable clothing through sheer skill and determination. They signed the contract with hands that trembled slightly, Carl gripping the pen hard enough that his knuckles went white, Elsa watching with tears in her eyes. They were committing to something that would define the rest of their lives and their children's lives, were taking on debt that would follow them for a decade, were betting everything on their ability to make this work. Nathan watched them sign and felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. These people were trusting him, were believing that the terms he offered were genuine and fair, were hoping that Montana territory would give them what Sweden could not. The second family was freedmen from Tennessee, the Washingtons, who arrived at the mill office wearing their best clothes, which were still worn and patched but clean, and pressed with the care that signaled self-respect and dignity. Moses Washington was a man in his 50s who had been born enslaved on a cotton plantation, who had gained freedom during the war, but had spent the 30 years since working other people's land, because owning land was a dream that seemed perpetually out of reach for someone born with his skin color in Tennessee. His wife Sarah carried herself with quiet strength, the kind that came from surviving circumstances that would have broken lesser people. They had 3 teenage children, all of whom sat silent and serious during the interview, understanding that this decision would shape their futures. Moses told Nathan his story simply and without self-pity. He had saved for 20 years to buy land in Tennessee, had accumulated enough for a down payment, had found a seller willing to accept his money. But the contract had clauses he could not read, terms that appeared reasonable until interpreted by a lawyer who explained that Moses would be paying 3 times market rate with balloon payments that would trigger foreclosure within 5 years. He had lost everything to that contract, had worked another decade to save again, had decided finally that Tennessee would never give him fair dealing, that he needed to go somewhere the past did not define the present. He had come to Montana because he heard there was opportunity for people willing to work, had found employment in Kalispell, had saved again with the grim determination of someone who had been cheated before and would not be cheated again. Nathan showed him the contract, had him read every word, explained every clause in simple language. The terms were exactly as advertised. $500 over 10 years, no hidden clauses, no balloon payments, no tricks. Moses read it 3 times before signing, his finger following each line, his lips moving slightly as he processed the legal language. When he finally put his signature on the paper, he looked up at Nathan with eyes that held profound gratitude mixed with residual suspicion born of experience. "You are giving us a fair chance," he said. "That is all we have ever wanted, a fair chance." Nathan nodded, feeling the weight of that statement, understanding that for Moses Washington, a fair chance was something he had never received in 52 years of life, something so rare it seemed almost miraculous. The third family was young and newly married, the Callahans from Iowa, looking for a fresh start after losing their first farm to bank foreclosure during the Panic of 1893. James Callahan was 24 years old but looked older, worn down by failure and the grinding poverty that followed, by watching his parents' farm auctioned off for debts they could not pay, by knowing he had been part of a system designed to extract wealth from farmers and funnel it to bankers and speculators. His wife Mary was 22, pregnant with their first child, determined that this baby would grow up on land they owned rather than land they rented. They came to the interview with a kind of desperate hope that was painful to witness, wanted this so badly that Nathan could see fear in their eyes that he would reject them, that he would judge them failures based on their history. But Nathan saw in them something he recognized. They had been knocked down and were getting back up. They had failed and were willing to try again. That took a kind of courage that mattered more than any track record of success. He gave them the contract and watched them read it together, James pointing out clauses to Mary, both of them checking to make sure they understood every term. When they signed, Mary started crying, tears running down her face as she wrote her name. James put his arm around her and thanked Nathan with a voice that broke slightly, emotion overwhelming his attempt at composure. One by one, the parcels filled through February and March. Norwegian families who had worked fishing boats in the old country and wanted to try farming in the new one. German families fleeing military conscription and economic hardship. Irish families escaping poverty in Boston and New York, willing to try the frontier rather than die slowly in urban slums. Freedmen families from across the South, each one carrying stories of violence and oppression, and the desperate hope that somewhere in America they could find the freedom that was supposed to be their birthright. Each one signing contracts, each one taking possession of burned land and the chance to transform it into something productive. By the end of March, all 12 parcels had been claimed, 12 families committed to building their futures on ground Nathan's grandfather had cleared and his brother had destroyed. Nathan helped them in ways that went beyond the land contracts. He provided timber from his mountain operation at cost, selling them larch boards and timbers for cabin construction at prices that barely covered his harvesting expenses. He loaned them tools and equipment, crosscut saws and axes and plows that could be returned when they could afford their own. He connected them with each other, encouraging cooperation, suggesting they share draft animals and heavy equipment, helping them form the bonds that would make them neighbors rather than just people living near each other. But his most significant contribution was the church. In April, Nathan gathered all 12 families for a meeting at what would become the center of their community. He had chosen a site on the boundary between 4 parcels, a slight rise with good drainage, and a view across the valley. He told them he would provide all the timber and labor to build a church on this spot, a proper building constructed from the same premium Western larch that had built the Lutheran church in Kalispell. The building would be simple but solid, designed to last for generations. It would serve as their community center, their meeting hall, their place of worship regardless of denomination. He would cover all construction costs. The only requirement was that they maintain it collectively, that they use it to build the kind of community his grandfather had envisioned when he first claimed this land. The families received this offer with a silence that spoke more than words could have. Some of them had tears in their eyes. None of them had expected this level of generosity, this kind of investment in their success. They agreed unanimously and immediately. Construction began in May with ceremony that matched the significance of what they were building. The 12 families gathered at dawn on a Saturday, bringing tools and determination, and the understanding that this building would be the heart of their community for generations. Nathan had already framed the structure in his mind, had sketched plans showing timber dimensions and joint configurations, had calculated board feet requirements down to the last plank. Lars and Eric and Olaf came down from the mountain camp to provide skilled labor and to teach techniques to men whose experience was farming rather than carpentry. The families contributed workers as they could spare them from their own homestead construction, fathers and teenage sons mostly. though some of the women proved as capable with hammer and saw as any man. Together they raised a building that would measure 40 feet long and 24 feet wide when complete, dimensions chosen to provide seating for 100 people with room for expansion if the community grew. The work began with foundation, digging trenches 2 feet deep, lining them with river stones set in lime mortar, creating a base that would support the structure even when spring runoff turned the surrounding ground to mud. The timber frame went up in a single day, a traditional barn raising adapted to church construction. Nathan had cut and shaped the primary timbers during winter, massive larch beams that had been growing when his grandfather first came to Montana, 8 by 8 posts for the corners and 6 by 12 beams for the roof structure. Each joint was mortise and tenon, carefully fitted so the wooden pins that secured them bore the load, rather than relying on metal hardware that could rust and fail. The raising required coordination and strength, and the kind of teamwork that builds community as surely as it builds buildings. 20 men working together, some holding timbers in position while others drove pins, all moving in response to shouted instructions from Lars, who directed operations from a vantage point where he could see the entire structure. When the final ridge beam was lifted into place and secured, someone started singing a Swedish hymn and others joined in, a spontaneous celebration of having accomplished something significant together. The walls went up over the following weeks, vertical larch boards with battens covering the joints in traditional board and batten style that allowed wood to expand and contract with moisture changes without creating gaps. Nathan planed each board himself, working at night after logging operations finished, running them through the thickness planer at Margaret's mill until they were smooth and uniform. The work was meditative, the repetitive motion allowing his mind to wander, while his hands performed tasks they knew by muscle memory. The roof was steep-pitched to shed the heavy snows that accumulated at this elevation through Montana winters. They covered it with hand-split shakes, thousands of them, each one split from larch heartwood using a froe and mallet, each one thin enough to lie flat but thick enough to last for decades. The work of splitting shakes occupied every evening for a month, men and teenage boys sitting in circles, talking while their hands worked, building the kind of relationships that came from shared labor toward common purpose. The interior was simple but beautiful in the way that honest craftsmanship is always beautiful. Larch timbers for the frame showed the natural golden color of the wood, the grain patterns visible even in the dim light that filtered through windows not yet glazed. Plank floors were laid with careful attention to level, each board fitted tightly to its neighbor, the entire surface planed smooth enough that women could walk barefoot without risk of splinters. Windows occupied the south wall, 6 of them, positioned to let in maximum light during winter when the sun rode low across the southern sky. The glass came from Kalispell, purchased with donations from the families, each pane carefully transported and installed in frames Nathan built to exact dimensions. When light came through those windows and struck the larch interior, the whole building seemed to glow from within, seemed to radiate warmth even before the fireplace was lit. The fireplace itself occupied the north end, built from river rocks gathered by all 12 families working together over 2 weeks. Each family had brought stones from their own parcels, contributing materials from their own land to this shared structure. The rocks were fitted without mortar in the Scandinavian style, relying on careful selection and placement to create a structure that would stand for centuries. The firebox was large enough to heat the entire building, the chimney massive enough to draw smoke even when wind conditions were difficult. Nathan worked alongside the other men through every phase of construction, his hands familiar with every aspect of the building. He cut mortises for the timber frame joints, shaped each piece to fit precisely with its neighbors using techniques his grandfather had taught him. He planed boards for the interior walls, working wood that had grown on his mountain, that he had cut and transported, and now was transforming into something that would serve these families for as long as the building stood. He found deep satisfaction in this work that went beyond the satisfaction of his timber operations. This was not commercial construction, not a job performed for payment. This was community building in the most literal sense, was creating the physical space where these families would gather for worship and celebration and support through hard times. Every timber he placed, every board he fitted, every joint he secured was an investment in something larger than individual success. Margaret came to see the work in early June. She rode out from her mill with a wagon full of supplies she had purchased in Kalispell, gifts for the new community. Cooking pots and tools, cloth for making curtains, a bell for the church tower that Nathan had not yet mentioned he planned to build. She walked through the construction site with Nathan, examining the timber work, running her hands over joints that fit so tightly no light showed between them. She met the families, talked with the women about their plans for gardens and livestock, discussed with the men their strategies for clearing and planting. She saw what Nathan was creating here, saw that it went beyond simple land sales, beyond business transactions. This was community building, was legacy creation, was Nathan taking something his brother had destroyed and transforming it into something better than it had been before. That evening, after the work crews had gone home and the construction site was quiet, Nathan and Margaret sat on the church steps watching the sun set over the valley. The sky turned orange and purple, clouds catching the light, the burned land around them looking less desolate in the soft evening glow. Margaret spoke without looking at him, her voice quiet but clear. "You are building something remarkable here, not just the church or the community, but what it represents. You could have kept this land, could have held it until the timber regrew and logged it yourself. Instead, you are giving people opportunity." Nathan was silent for a moment, watching the light fade. He had not articulated his reasons even to himself, had simply known this felt right, felt like what the land needed, what his grandfather would have wanted. Finally, he spoke. "My grandfather came to Montana with nothing except an axe and determination. Someone gave him a chance by selling him land on terms he could afford. He built something that should have lasted for generations. Samuel destroyed that legacy with greed and lies. I'm trying to create a different legacy, one that cannot be stolen or burned or lost to foreclosure. These families will remember that someone gave them their chance. Maybe they will do the same for others when their time comes." Margaret turned to look at him, her face serious in the dimming light. She reached out and took his hand, the first time they had touched deliberately, the first open acknowledgement of what had been growing between them for 3 years. Her hand was warm and calloused from mill work, strong and capable. She said she admired that about him, that he could have become bitter after what Samuel did, but instead had become generous. That he could have focused on revenge but chose to focus on building. That he understood legacy was not about accumulating wealth, but about the impact you had on other people's lives. Nathan felt his chest tighten with emotion he had been holding back for longer than he wanted to admit. Margaret was not just his business partner, not just someone who understood timber and markets. She was someone who saw him clearly, who recognized not just his skills but his character, who valued the same things he valued. He asked her a question he had been considering for months, but had not known how to voice. "Would you consider marrying me?" The words came out more abruptly than he had intended, without the eloquence or romance the moment probably deserved. But they were honest, and Margaret seemed to appreciate that. She did not answer immediately. She sat holding his hand, looking out at the valley where lights were beginning to appear in the cabins of the families who would become their neighbors. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty. "Yes, but I have conditions." Nathan waited, willing to hear whatever she required. Margaret laid out her terms with the same clarity she brought to business contracts. She would not give up the mill. It was hers, built with her labor after her husband died, proof that she could succeed on her own. She wanted partnership, not dependency. They would merge their businesses formally, would share ownership and decision-making equally. She would not be a wife who stayed home while her husband worked. She would continue running the mill, would remain active in the timber business, would be Nathan's equal partner in every sense. Nathan agreed without hesitation. He wanted exactly what she was describing, wanted a partner who brought skills and judgment and independence. He had no interest in a wife who would simply keep his house and raise his children. He wanted someone who understood his work, who could advise and challenge and collaborate. They would marry in September, Margaret said, after the church was finished, in the building Nathan was constructing. That seemed appropriate somehow, seemed like the right beginning for a marriage that would be built on the same principles as the church. Solid foundations, honest work, structures designed to last. The church was completed in late August. The families gathered for the final work, installing the bell in the tower Nathan had built at the west end, hanging the heavy bronze with ropes and careful coordination. When it rang for the first time, the sound carried across the valley, clear and strong, announcing that this community existed, that these families had built something worth celebrating. Nathan and Margaret married on September 15, 1895, in the church built from larch that had grown on Nathan's mountain. The ceremony was simple but well attended. Lars and Ingrid stood with them. The 12 cooperative families filled the pews. A circuit preacher who traveled through Montana territory performed the service, reading from a worn Bible, asking questions that had been asked at weddings for centuries. Nathan wore a new suit, the first he had owned since before his father died, dark wool that felt strange and constraining after years of working clothes. Margaret wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, practical but beautiful, her hair pulled back in the Swedish style. They exchanged vows that promised partnership and loyalty and mutual support, words they both meant with absolute sincerity. The families provided food for a celebration that lasted into the evening, everyone contributing what they could, the church filling with the smells of cooking and the sounds of conversation and laughter. Children ran between the pews, chasing each other, their voices high and happy. Men stood in groups discussing crops and timber prices and the best methods for clearing burned stumps. Women shared recipes and advice about gardens and preserving food for winter. Nathan stood with Margaret watching the celebration, feeling something he had not felt since his father's death. He belonged somewhere. He was part of a community. He had built something that would outlast him, that would continue long after he was gone. They spent their wedding night at Margaret's house near the mill, a frame building she had built herself after her first husband died. It was modest but comfortable, filled with books and tools, and the accumulated possessions of someone who valued utility over decoration. They lay awake talking long into the night, making plans for combining their operations, for expanding both the logging and milling sides of the business, for building a life together that would be defined by partnership rather than traditional roles. In October, they formalized the business merger. Garrett Mountain Timber and Lindstrom Sawmill became Garrett and Lindstrom Timber Company. Ownership split equally, both names on all documents, both signatures required for major decisions. Margaret would manage the mill and handle sales and contracts. Nathan would manage logging operations and timber harvesting. They would consult on everything, would make decisions together, would build something neither could have built alone. They decided to build a house on Nathan's mountain tract, a proper home that would accommodate a family. Through November and December, while Nathan continued logging operations, they designed and planned. The house would sit on the gentler ground below the stone cabin, would face south to catch winter sun, would be built entirely from larch with timber frame construction that would last for generations. Construction began in the spring of 1896, the same crews that had built the church now raising a house for the couple who had made the church possible. The building grew through the summer, 2 stories with 4 rooms downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs, a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, windows positioned to frame views of the valley below. Margaret was pregnant by the time they moved in that fall. Their first child, a son they named Joseph after Nathan's father, was born in January of 1897. The labor was long and difficult, Margaret attended by a midwife from Kalispell and by Ingrid whose Swedish practicality proved invaluable. Nathan waited downstairs, pacing the floor of the house he had built, listening to sounds from upstairs that frightened him more than any danger he had faced in logging operations. But when the baby finally came, when the midwife brought him downstairs wrapped in flannel and placed him in Nathan's arms, Nathan felt something shift in his understanding of what mattered. This small life, this child who bore his father's name, represented continuity, represented the future in ways that timber contracts and land ownership never could. Joseph was followed by a daughter in 1898, Anna, named after Margaret's mother who had died in Sweden before Margaret emigrated. By 1899, their family was complete, 2 children who would grow up on the mountain, who would learn timber and business, and the values their parents believed mattered most. Nathan began teaching them as soon as they could understand, taking Joseph to the logging sites when he was barely old enough to walk, showing him trees and explaining how to read grain and assess quality. He taught Anna the same lessons when she showed interest, refusing to limit her education based on gender. Margaret taught them both mathematics and literacy, using mill accounts and inventory records, practical education that would serve them regardless of what paths they eventually chose. But the most important lessons happened at the stone cabin. Nathan kept the structure maintained, repairing the roof each spring, keeping the chimney clear, ensuring it remained habitable. Once a month he would take the family there, would spend the night in the place where his journey had truly begun. They would sleep on the dirt floor in bedrolls, would cook simple meals over the fire, would wake to mountain silence. The children loved these trips, saw them as adventures, as camping rather than the stark survival those nights had represented for Nathan in that first brutal winter. But Nathan wanted them to understand what the cabin meant, what it represented about persistence and determination, and the ability to build something from nothing. On a cool evening in October of 1899, Nathan sat with 6-year-old Joseph outside the stone cabin, looking down at the valley where lights were appearing in the settlement windows. Anna was 3, already asleep inside the cabin. Margaret was reading by firelight, giving Nathan time alone with his son. Joseph asked the question Nathan had been waiting for. Why do we come here when we have a good house? Nathan chose his words carefully, wanting the boy to understand not just the facts but the meaning beneath them. Your Uncle Samuel gave me this mountain because he thought it was worthless. He thought he was punishing me by taking everything else. But this place taught me something important. He pointed down at the valley where the church steeple was just visible in the gathering darkness, where the lights of 12 family homesteads glowed warm against the night. When everything is taken from you, you discover what you are actually made of. Not what you inherit or what people give you, but what you can build with your own hands and mind and determination. Your uncle took the land our grandfather cleared. This mountain gave me something better. Joseph listened with the serious attention children sometimes bring to important moments, sensing that his father was telling him something that mattered. Nathan continued, "Someday you will face times when circumstances seem impossible, when other people judge you finished, when everything appears lost. Remember this cabin. Remember that your father had nothing here except stone walls and a spring and determination, and he built everything you will inherit. Not just the business or the land, but the knowledge that you carry everything you truly need inside yourself. Other people can take your possessions, can steal your property, can destroy what you have built, but they cannot take who you are. They cannot steal your knowledge or your character or your ability to solve problems and build solutions. The boy was too young to fully understand. Nathan knew. But the seed was planted, would grow over years of repeated lessons, would eventually blossom into understanding when Joseph faced his own challenges. Margaret joined them outside, carrying Anna wrapped in a blanket, the child drowsy but awake. They sat together as a family, looking down at the valley, at the community Nathan had helped create, at the physical evidence of what could be built from determination and honest work. Letters from Samuel came twice a year, regular as seasons, brief and formal. He had found work in Seattle as a clerk in a shipping office, employment that used his education but offered no path to advancement. He lived in a boarding house, saved nothing, had no prospects for improvement. The letters never asked for money, never requested help, simply reported on his circumstances with a flatness that suggested acceptance rather than hope. Nathan read each letter and filed it away, maintaining minimal contact but nothing more. The anger had faded over the years, replaced by something closer to pity. Samuel had chosen his path, had prioritized shortcuts and deception over honest work, and was living with the consequences. One letter in early 1900 contained a single additional sentence after the usual report on health and employment. I envy what you have built, not the wealth or the business, but the knowledge that it was earned through your own effort. Nathan did not respond to that letter directly, but he thought about it often, thought about how different their lives had become from the trajectory that seemed inevitable when they were young. Samuel had seemed destined for success, educated and connected and confident. Nathan had been the rough younger brother, more comfortable with tools than books, valued for his labor but not his judgment. The mountain had reversed their positions, had revealed that practical knowledge and character mattered more than formal education and social connections. Samuel's sophistication had built nothing lasting. Nathan's stubbornness had created a legacy that would endure for generations. The timber business continued to grow. By 1900, Garrett and Lindstrom Timber Company employed 30 people between logging operations and the mill, produced more than 1 million board feet per year, supplied customers throughout Montana, Idaho, and Washington territories. The business was successful enough to provide comfortable lives for both families, to invest in equipment and improvements, to save against future needs. But success was not measured in dollars for Nathan. It was measured in the church that stood solid at the center of the cooperative community, in the 12 families who had transformed burned land into productive farms, in the relationships built on mutual respect rather than manipulation or coercion. It was measured in Margaret's partnership, in knowing he had found someone who valued the same things he valued, who brought skills and judgment that made their combined efforts more effective than either could have achieved alone. It was measured in Joseph and Anna learning lessons about persistence and integrity, in watching them grow up understanding that worth came from work rather than inheritance. It was measured in standing on the porch of the house he had built and looking up at the larch groves that continued to produce premium timber year after year, proof that sustainable harvesting worked, that you could take from the forest without destroying it if you managed resources wisely and thought in timelines longer than immediate profit. On a summer evening in 1901, Nathan and Margaret sat on that porch after the children had gone to bed. They were talking about nothing important, about orders for the coming season, about improvements to the mill, about whether they should expand into new markets. The conversation was comfortable, familiar, the kind of talk that happens between people who have built a life together. Margaret said something that made Nathan pause. She said she had been thinking about the first time she visited the mountain, when Nathan had just delivered his initial timber harvest, when he was still living alone in the stone cabin with nothing but determination and a plan that might have failed. She said she had known then that he would succeed, not because of the quality of his timber, though that was excellent, but because of how he approached problems, how he refused to accept impossibility, how he kept working toward solutions even when conventional wisdom said there were none. She said she had fallen in love with that quality before she fell in love with him, had admired his mind before she noticed anything else. And she said watching him build the cooperative, watching him give other families the same kind of chance someone had given his grandfather, had confirmed everything she believed about his character. Nathan felt emotion tighten his chest the way it had that evening on the church steps when Margaret agreed to marry him. He was not accustomed to such direct acknowledgement, to having his efforts recognized and valued in ways that went beyond business success. He told her the truth he had never quite articulated before, that he could not have built any of this without her, that her technical knowledge and business judgment had made his timber operation possible, that her partnership had given him confidence to attempt things he would not have tried alone, that her presence in his life had transformed survival into something richer and more meaningful. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell completely, as stars emerged overhead, as the mountain settled into its evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled, the sound echoing off the slopes. Closer in, an owl called from the forest edge. This was Nathan's life now. The mountain that had been given to him as worthless had become the foundation of everything valuable. The isolation that was meant to break him had forged him into someone stronger. The betrayal that could have destroyed him had revealed capacities he did not know he possessed. He had built an empire from a stone cabin and determination, had reclaimed stolen land through honest earnings, had created community where his brother had created only resentment, had found partnership where he might have remained alone, had built a legacy that would outlast him. Samuel had given him a mountain everyone said was worthless, thinking it was punishment. Nathan had proven it was providence, had demonstrated that worthless land in the right hands could become more valuable than any inheritance. Because inheritance could be stolen with forged documents and false witnesses. But what a man built himself through knowledge and character, and refusal to quit, that could never be taken away. That became part of who he was, part of what he could teach his children, part of the legacy that would continue long after the timber was harvested and the buildings had aged, and everyone who remembered these early years had passed. Nathan sat on his porch with his wife beside him, his children sleeping upstairs, his business thriving, his community growing. And he felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had taken the worst his brother could do and transformed it into the best possible outcome. The worthless mountain had taught him well, had taught him that value is created, not given, that character matters more than circumstances, that the only wealth that truly counts is the kind you build with your own hands and cannot be separated from who you are. And Nathan Garrett, sitting on the porch of a house built from timber he had logged on a mountain everyone said was worthless, knew he was wealthy beyond anything Samuel could understand. The years between 1900 and 1910 transformed the cooperative community from a collection of struggling homesteads into something that resembled Nathan's vision when he first rode across the burned land. The 12 families had cleared their parcels through years of backbreaking labor, pulling stumps with teams of horses, breaking ground that had been baked hard by fire, amending soil with manure and crop rotation until it produced again. The work had been exactly as brutal as Nathan warned, had tested marriages and broken the health of some, had driven one family back to Iowa after 2 hard years proved too much for them to endure. But the 11 families who remained had built homes that progressed from rough log cabins with dirt floors to proper frame houses with wooden floors and glass windows, as timber became available and savings accumulated. The progression told the story of their success, each improvement marking another year survived, another crop harvested, another payment made on land contracts that were slowly converting rented ground into owned property. Fields that had been ash and blackened stumps in 1895 now produced wheat that waved golden in summer wind, hay that fed cattle through hard winters, vegetables that filled root cellars against the lean months. Carl Anderson's wheat consistently won prizes at the county fair, the heavy heads thick with grain, the stalks strong from Swedish farming techniques adapted to Montana soil. Moses Washington's cattle were known throughout the valley for their quality, the result of careful breeding and the grazing management he had learned through decades of observation, even when the land and animals he managed belonged to others. Pastures supported herds that grew year by year as families reinvested profits into breeding stock rather than spending on luxuries they had learned to live without. The Callahans ran sheep, Mary proving to have an instinct for animal husbandry that made their operation profitable when others struggled. The Norwegian families focused on dairy, their butter and cheese sold as far away as Helena, the quality so consistent that stores requested their products by name. Orchards planted in those early years with seedlings Nathan had purchased at cost were beginning to bear fruit, apple and pear trees that required years of patience before producing, but that would feed families for generations once established. Children who had planted those trees as youngsters were now teenagers picking fruit from branches they remembered as whips thin as their fingers. The church stood at the center of it all, exactly as Nathan had intended. Services were held every Sunday, rotating between Lutheran and Methodist preachers who traveled circuits through Montana territory. Occasionally a Catholic priest from Kalispell who served the Irish families with patience and good humor, despite the theological differences that might have divided them in other circumstances. But the building's real importance went beyond religious denomination, went beyond the formal worship that brought people together one morning per week. It was where the community gathered for weddings, and there had been many as the first children of the cooperative reached marrying age and chose partners from neighboring farms, creating bonds that knit the community even tighter. It was where funerals were held, and there had been those too, old age and accident, and the occasional illness claiming lives that were mourned collectively, grief shared among people who understood loss because they had all risked everything to be here. It was where harvest celebrations happened each fall, tables laden with food each family brought, evidence of the year's success spread out for everyone to see and share. It was where winter socials broke the isolation of Montana cold, where fiddle music and dancing reminded people that life was more than work and survival. It was where meetings took place to make collective decisions about road maintenance and school funding and mutual aid, when families faced hardship that would overwhelm individual resources, but could be managed through communal effort. Nathan attended regularly with Margaret and the children, sitting in pews he had built from larch he had logged, under timbers he had raised, surrounded by families whose presence on this land he had made possible. He watched children grow up together, saw friendships form across ethnic lines that would have been impossible in the old country or in other parts of America where prejudice ran deeper. Swedish children played with freedmen children with Irish children with Norwegian children, united by shared experience of growing up together in a place where everyone's parents were immigrants of one kind or another, where everyone started with nothing and built through labor. The cooperative had become exactly what Nathan hoped it would be. Not just 12 separate farms, but a genuine community where people helped each other through difficulties, where barn raisings and harvests were collective efforts, where a family facing illness or injury could count on neighbors to keep their operation running until they recovered. The bonds formed during that first summer of church construction had deepened over years of shared experience, had created something that went beyond simple proximity. Nathan's children grew up embedded in this community, learning its values through daily example rather than abstract instruction. Joseph was 13 in 1910, already taller than his mother and showing signs he would match Nathan's height eventually. He spent summers working the timber operations, learning to read trees and assess quality, developing the practical skills Nathan valued. But he also showed intellectual capacity that reminded Nathan uncomfortably of Samuel at that age. A quickness, with numbers and concepts that suggested formal education, might serve him well. Anna was 12, already helping Margaret at the mill office, learning bookkeeping and contract negotiation, demonstrating that her mother's business acumen had been passed on genetically or through constant exposure. She could calculate board feet yields faster than Nathan, could remember customer preferences and pricing structures without consulting records, showed every sign of becoming a formidable businesswoman in her own right. Nathan and Margaret discussed their children's futures often during those years, usually in the evenings after the children had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table in the house Nathan had built, drinking coffee that had become ritual as much as refreshment, talking through options and possibilities and fears neither wanted to voice too directly. They both understood that Joseph and Anna would have choices their parents had not had, would be able to pursue education and opportunities that went beyond timber and farming if they chose, would not be constrained by the limitations that had shaped Nathan and Margaret's early lives. Margaret argued for sending Joseph to university, maybe to Missoula, where the state university was establishing forestry and business programs that would give him formal knowledge to complement the practical skills he was learning in the timber operations. She believed education was insurance, was protection against the kind of betrayal Nathan had suffered, was armor against the world's tendency to dismiss practical knowledge as inferior to formal credentials. Nathan was less certain, worried that education might pull his son away from the mountain and the timber operations the way formal learning had pulled Samuel away from practical skills, might create the same division between theoretical and applied knowledge that had separated him from his brother. He had seen too many university-educated men look down on loggers and farmers, had experienced too much condescension from people who knew books but could not read trees, who understood theories but could not solve actual problems. He feared education might make Joseph ashamed of his father's work, might lead him to seek softer employment in cities, might cause him to value credentials over capability. But Margaret reminded him gently but persistently that knowledge was knowledge, that formal education did not have to conflict with practical skills if properly balanced, that the best foresters were those who understood both science and experience. She pointed out that the timber industry was changing, that new technologies and management techniques required theoretical understanding. Nathan had learned through trial and error, but that Joseph could learn systematically. She reminded him that Samuel's failure was not caused by education, but by character, by choosing deception over honesty, shortcuts over sustained effort. This was one of their longest-running disagreements, not quite an argument because they never raised voices or spoke with anger, but a fundamental difference in how they saw their children's futures. It took years to resolve, countless conversations circling the same concerns and possibilities, before they found common ground. They compromised finally on a hybrid approach that satisfied neither perfectly, but that both could accept. Joseph would continue working the timber operations full-time, learning the business from ground level as Nathan had, developing the practical judgment that came only from direct experience with trees and terrain, and the thousand small decisions that separated successful logging from failure. But he would also study mathematics and forestry science through correspondence courses offered by the university, would develop theoretical understanding to complement practical experience, would learn to speak the language of educated foresters while maintaining the hands-on skills that made that education useful rather than merely decorative. Anna would do the same with business and accounting, would continue her apprenticeship at the mill learning from Margaret's example, while also pursuing formal education in bookkeeping and contract law, and the financial management that would let her operate confidently in business environments where women were expected to defer to male authority. The combination would make her formidable, would give her both practical capability and credentialed expertise that would be harder to dismiss or undermine. The timber business continued to grow through this decade, expanding into new markets as railroads opened new territories and construction boomed throughout the Northwest. Garrett and Lindstrom Timber Company employed 60 people by 1908, operated 3 logging camps in addition to Nathan's original mountain operation, supplied mills throughout Montana and Idaho and Washington. Annual production exceeded 2 million board feet. Revenue climbed past $50,000 per year. But success brought complications Nathan had not anticipated. The original operation had been simple, just Nathan and a few skilled loggers working terrain everyone said was impossible, producing premium timber through methods Nathan invented and refined. Now there were managers and supervisors, payroll systems and safety regulations, contracts with deadlines and penalty clauses, customers whose demands sometimes conflicted with sustainable forestry practices Nathan believed in. He found himself spending more time in offices than in forests, more time reviewing accounts than cutting timber, more time managing people than managing trees. The work was necessary, and he performed it competently, but it lacked the immediate satisfaction of physical labor, the direct connection between effort and result that had characterized those early years. Margaret recognized his restlessness before Nathan fully articulated it himself. One evening in 1909, she suggested they hire a general manager to handle daily operations, someone who could manage the administrative side, while Nathan and Margaret focused on strategy and quality control. It would cost money but would free them to do the work they actually enjoyed, would let them spend more time teaching Joseph and Anna, would give them space to think beyond immediate demands. Nathan agreed, and they brought in a man named Thomas Riley, a trained forester from Oregon who understood both timber science and business operations. Riley was competent and honest, exactly what they needed, and his presence allowed Nathan to return to the mountain more often, to spend days walking timber stands and planning selective harvests, to reconnect with the work that had originally drawn him to logging. But even with Riley managing operations, Nathan felt something shifting in himself during this period. He was 45 years old in 1910, no longer the young man who had survived that first brutal winter in the stone cabin. His hands showed the accumulated scars of 2 decades of timber work. His back ached on cold mornings from years of swinging axes and pulling crosscut saws. He could still outwork most men half his age, but he felt time pressing in ways he had not felt before. He began taking Joseph and Anna to the stone cabin more frequently during these years, monthly trips becoming weekly when weather allowed. The cabin had become a kind of shrine in Nathan's mind, a physical reminder of where he had started and how far he had come. He maintained it obsessively, replacing shakes on the roof at the first sign of wear, keeping the chimney clear, ensuring the structure remained exactly as it had been when he first made it habitable. On a cool September evening in 1910, Nathan sat with 13-year-old Joseph outside the cabin, watching the sun set over the valley where the cooperative community spread below them. Anna was inside with Margaret, helping prepare the simple meal they would eat before sleeping on the dirt floor in the old way. This had become ritual, this monthly reminder of how Nathan had lived during those first years, this deliberate return to simplicity and hardship as antidote to the comfort and success that now characterized their daily lives. Joseph had been quiet all day, clearly working through some internal question. Nathan waited, having learned that his son thought carefully before speaking. That silence meant processing rather than absence of thought. Finally, as the last light faded and stars began appearing overhead, Joseph asked what he had been considering. "Why do we keep coming here? We have a good house. We have enough money that we do not need to pretend to be poor. Why do you make us sleep on the ground and eat simple food when we could be comfortable?" The question was fair, and Nathan had been expecting some version of it for years. Joseph was old enough now to understand economics, to know their family was wealthy by any reasonable measure, to recognize that these trips to the stone cabin were choices rather than necessities. He deserved an honest answer, not platitudes about character building or appreciation for hardship. Nathan gathered his thoughts, looking out at the valley where lights were beginning to appear in windows, where the church steeple rose dark against the dimming sky, where everything he had built over 20 years was visible in physical form. "Your Uncle Samuel gave me this mountain because he thought it was worthless," Nathan began. "He thought he was punishing me by taking the family timber company and leaving me with land everyone agreed could not be logged. He thought he had won and I had lost." Joseph nodded, knowing this part of the story, having heard versions of it since childhood. Nathan continued, "But this cabin taught me something Samuel never understood. When everything is taken from you, when you are reduced to stone walls and a dirt floor and nothing except your own determination, you discover what you are actually made of. Not what you inherited or what people gave you or what advantages you started with, but what you can build with your own hands and mind and refusal to quit." He pointed down at the valley. "Everything you see down there, the cooperative farms and the church and the community that has grown up around it, all of that came from what I learned in this cabin. Not timber techniques or business strategies, though those mattered, but something deeper. The understanding that value is created, not given. That worthless land in the right hands with the right knowledge becomes more valuable than any inheritance." Joseph listened with the serious attention he brought to important lessons, his young face thoughtful in the starlight. Nathan went on, "Someday you will face circumstances that seem impossible. Everyone does eventually. You will lose something you thought you could not live without, or fail at something you believed you had to succeed at, or be betrayed by someone you trusted. And in that moment you will have a choice. You can give up, can accept that circumstances have defeated you, or you can remember this cabin." He put his hand on the stone wall, feeling the cold, rough surface that had sheltered him through that first brutal winter. "Your grandfather built this land with nothing except an axe and determination. Your uncle destroyed it with greed and lies. I rebuilt it with knowledge and honest work. You will face your own version of that cycle. What matters is what you choose to build when it is your turn." Joseph was quiet for a long time after Nathan finished speaking. When he finally responded, his voice carried understanding that went beyond his years. "You keep the cabin because it reminds you who you are, not the successful businessman, the man who survived when everyone expected him to fail." Nathan felt his chest tighten with emotion. His son understood, perhaps better than Nathan had articulated. Yes, exactly that. Success can make you forget what built the success. This cabin prevents that forgetting. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness arrived, as the mountain settled into its evening quiet. Inside the cabin, Anna and Margaret were laughing about something, their voices carrying warmth through the door. The sound was so different from those early years when Nathan had sat in the same spot alone, wondering if he would survive the winter, if his plans would work, if the worthless mountain would produce anything except isolation and failure. He had survived. The plans had worked. The mountain had produced beyond anything he imagined that first desperate year. And now he sat with his son, teaching him lessons that went beyond timber and business, lessons about character and persistence, and the difference between inherited wealth and earned worth. Letters from Samuel had continued arriving twice yearly through this entire decade, regular as clockwork, brief and formal and increasingly resigned. He remained in Seattle, still working as a shipping clerk, still living in the same boarding house, still trapped in the consequences of choices made decades earlier. The letters never complained, never asked for help, simply reported on circumstances with a flatness that suggested Samuel had accepted that his life would not improve, that he had reached his ceiling and would remain there until death. But in 1911, the letters stopped. Nathan waited through spring and into summer, expecting the usual update, but nothing arrived. In August, he received a different kind of letter, this one from a lawyer in Seattle informing him that Samuel Coleman had died in June from pneumonia, had been found in his boarding house room 3 days after death by a landlord wondering about unpaid rent. The lawyer was settling Samuel's estate, such as it was. There were no assets beyond some clothing and a few books, no savings or property or anything of value. But there was a letter addressed to Nathan, written apparently months before Samuel's death, and left with the lawyer for delivery in case of exactly this circumstance. Nathan opened the letter sitting at his kitchen table, Margaret across from him, the children in bed upstairs. He recognized Samuel's handwriting immediately, the careful script that had not changed since they were young, when Samuel was the educated brother destined for success, and Nathan was the rough younger one valued only for his labor. The letter began without greeting or preamble, jumped straight into what Samuel wanted to say. I am writing this knowing I will likely die soon. The cough that started in winter has not improved, and I cannot afford doctors who might help. I do not write seeking pity or assistance. I write because there are things that need to be said before I am gone and no longer capable of saying them. You were right about everything, and I was wrong about everything. That is the simple truth I have had 20 years to contemplate from this boarding house room, where I have lived alone with the consequences of my choices. I thought education and connections were worth more than your practical skills. I thought manipulation was smarter than honest work. I thought worthless land was truly worthless, and valuable land would remain valuable regardless of who owned it or how they managed it. Every single one of those assumptions proved catastrophically incorrect. You took the mountain I gave you as punishment and transformed it into an empire. You took burned land I destroyed and turned it into a thriving community. You found a partner who respected your knowledge and built a business that will outlast both of you. You raised children who will carry on what you created. I took everything Father built and turned it to ash even before the fire came. I built nothing that lasted, created nothing of value, formed no genuine relationships, left no legacy worth remembering. I will die in this room and be buried in an unmarked grave because I could not afford otherwise, and because there is no one who cares enough to pay for anything better. This is not your fault. You offered me mercy when I deserved none, paid my debts when you could have let me drown, gave me the chance to start over. I wasted that chance the same way I wasted every other opportunity in my life. The failure is mine alone. I want you to know that I spent these years understanding what Father tried to teach us both. That character matters more than cleverness. That building something real requires honesty and persistence and willingness to work harder than seems reasonable. That the easy path leads nowhere worth going. You learned those lessons and I did not. That is the difference between us, the reason your life has meaning and mine does not. I am not asking forgiveness. What I did to you is unforgivable, and I have never expected you to forgive it. I am simply acknowledging the truth and hoping you will know that I recognized it, even if recognition came too late to change anything. You won, Nathan, not just in business or wealth, but in every way that actually matters. You built a life worth living. I did not. That is justice, and I accept it. Your brother, Samuel. Nathan read the letter twice, hands steady despite the emotion rising in his chest, then handed it to Margaret without speaking, unable to trust his voice in that moment. She read it in silence while Nathan sat with his hands folded on the table, feeling emotions he could not quite name swirling through him like smoke that refused to settle into recognizable shapes. Not triumph, though Samuel's acknowledgement of defeat was complete and absolute, though vindication was total in ways Nathan had never sought but could not deny feeling. Not satisfaction, though there was grim justice in Samuel dying alone, and poor after choosing wealth over integrity, though the symmetry was almost too perfect to be coincidental. Something closer to sadness, to recognition of waste and potential unrealized, of a life that could have been different if different choices had been made at critical junctures. Samuel had been intelligent, perhaps more intelligent than Nathan in conventional measures. He had been educated and articulate and capable of understanding complex concepts. With those gifts, he could have built something meaningful, could have contributed value rather than extracting it, could have ended his life surrounded by family and legacy rather than dying alone in a boarding house room where no one noticed his absence for 3 days. But he had chosen differently at every branch point, had always taken the path that seemed smarter in the moment but led nowhere meaningful in the long run. And those choices had compounded over decades into isolation and failure, and a death so lonely that the only person who cared enough to write about it was a lawyer being paid to settle an estate that contained nothing worth settling. Margaret finished reading and looked at Nathan with eyes that understood what he was feeling without need for explanation, that recognized the complexity of his reaction without trying to simplify it into something more manageable. She asked the only question that mattered in immediate practical terms. Do you want to go to Seattle, to see where he lived, to arrange a proper burial? Nathan thought about this for a long time, staring at the letter in Margaret's hands, seeing Samuel's careful script, remembering when they were boys and Samuel would help Nathan with reading and arithmetic, when there had been affection between them, when the future seemed to hold room for both of them to succeed. He thought about the man Samuel had become, the choices that had led him from that promising beginning to that lonely ending. He thought about what Samuel would want, whether his brother would appreciate Nathan's involvement or see it as one more reminder of Nathan's success and his failure, one more instance of Nathan having to rescue him from consequences he had created. Part of him wanted to go, wanted to see the end of his brother's story with his own eyes, wanted to understand concretely what Samuel's life had become in those final years, wanted to ensure Samuel received at least the dignity of a marked grave, and perhaps a service where someone spoke words over his remains even if no one who heard them had known him personally. It seemed like something a brother should do, seemed like the kind of duty that transcended the betrayal and anger and estrangement that had defined their relationship for 2 decades. But another part knew that Samuel would not have wanted that, would have seen Nathan's presence at his grave as another kind of charity he could not repay, another reminder that Nathan had succeeded where Samuel failed, Another instance of Nathan being generous when Samuel deserved nothing. The letter itself felt like Samuel's attempt to prevent exactly that kind of intervention. Was his final accounting delivered in a way that did not require Nathan's presence or participation, that let Samuel control how his story ended without imposing further obligation on the brother he had wronged? He decided finally that the letter was Samuel's real grave marker, his final accounting, his honest assessment of what his life had amounted to in the end. It was more truth than Samuel had spoken while alive, more genuine than any eulogy Nathan could commission from a Seattle minister who had never known the man. Nathan would keep the letter, would preserve it as evidence that even Samuel eventually understood the truth about value and character, and the difference between clever and wise. But he would not go to Seattle, would not try to impose meaning on an ending Samuel had already accepted with clear eyes and what seemed like genuine understanding. He wrote to the lawyer authorizing payment for a simple grave marker with Samuel's name and dates, nothing elaborate, just acknowledgement that Samuel Coleman had existed and died. The cost was minimal and seemed appropriate. Then Nathan filed the letter away with other important documents and tried to process what it meant. The stone cabin took on even deeper significance after Samuel's death. Nathan found himself going there more often alone, sitting in the space where his journey had truly begun, thinking about two brothers who started from the same place and ended in such different circumstances. The difference had not been intelligence or education or initial advantages. Samuel had been smarter in conventional terms, had been better educated, had started with more connections and opportunities. The difference had been character and choices. Nathan had chosen to build when circumstances suggested quitting, had chosen honesty when deception seemed easier, had chosen to create value rather than extract it, to form genuine partnerships rather than exploitative relationships, to think in timelines longer than immediate profit. Those choices had compounded over decades into everything he now possessed. Samuel had chosen differently at every branch point, had always taken the path that seemed smarter in the moment but led nowhere meaningful in the long run. And those choices had compounded, too, into isolation and failure, and a death so lonely his body went undiscovered for days. In the fall of 1912, Nathan made a decision that had been forming in his mind for years. He was 47 years old, wealthy enough to retire if he chose, successful beyond anything he had imagined that first winter. But he had no intention of retiring. The timber business still fascinated him. The challenge of sustainable forestry still engaged his mind. He planned to continue working for decades if health permitted. But he wanted to formalize the legacy, wanted to ensure that what he had built would continue after he was gone. He called Joseph and Anna together for a family meeting, the four of them sitting at the kitchen table that had witnessed so many important conversations over the years. He told them he was transferring ownership of the business to the three of them equally, 1/3 to Margaret, 1/3 to Joseph, 1/3 to Anna. He would retain management authority while he lived, but legal ownership would pass now rather than waiting for his death. This would ensure continuity, would give the children stake in the business's success, would formalize what had always been true, that this was a family enterprise built by all of them together. Joseph was 19 now, already working full-time in the timber operations, showing every sign of becoming an excellent forester. Anna was 17, managing significant portions of the mill operations, demonstrating business judgment that matched and sometimes exceeded her mother's. They were ready for this responsibility, were already carrying it in everything but legal formality. But Nathan added one condition. The business would remain focused on sustainable forestry, on selective harvesting that preserved forest health, on quality over quantity, on building relationships rather than maximizing short-term profit. If they ever chose to clear-cut stands for immediate return, if they ever compromised quality to undercut competitors, if they ever treated workers as disposable resources rather than valued partners, Nathan would consider the legacy betrayed regardless of what legal documents said. Both children agreed solemnly, understanding that Nathan was not just transferring ownership, but entrusting them with values, with an approach to business that went beyond economics into ethics and long-term thinking. Margaret added her own condition, that the cooperative families would always receive timber at cost for repairs and improvements, that the church would always be maintained at company expense, that the community Nathan had created would be supported regardless of whether it made business sense in narrow terms. This was not charity, she explained, but enlightened self-interest. The community was where their workers came from, where their customers lived, where their children were growing up. Supporting it was supporting themselves. Again, both children agreed, and the papers were signed that afternoon. The years between 1912 and 1920 brought changes to Montana and to the timber industry that would have been unimaginable when Nathan first stood in that worthless mountain tract. The Great War in Europe created unprecedented demand for lumber. Prices climbed to levels that made even Nathan's premium larch seem moderately priced. New logging technologies, gasoline-powered saws and mechanized equipment, transformed operations that had been purely muscle-powered. Railroads penetrated deeper into forest land, opening territories that had been inaccessible. Garrett and Lindstrom Timber Company grew with the industry, annual production climbing past 3 million board feet, employment exceeding 100 workers. But the company maintained the principles Nathan had established: selective harvesting even when clear cutting was more profitable, quality focus, even when demand exceeded supply, fair treatment of workers even when labor was abundant and could be exploited. The cooperative community prospered through this period as well. Most of the original 12 families had paid off their land contracts by 1915, owned their parcels outright, were building equity that would pass to their children. Second-generation kids were graduating from high school, some going on to university, some staying to farm, all of them carrying forward the values their parents had instilled. Nathan watched all this with satisfaction that deepened as he aged. He was 55 in 1920, his hair going gray, his body showing the accumulated wear of 3 decades of physical labor. He had slowed down, could no longer work the long hours that had characterized his 30s and 40s, found himself needing rest more frequently. But his mind remained sharp, his judgment sound, his commitment to the business and community unwavering. He spent more time at the stone cabin during these years, sometimes alone, sometimes with Margaret, sometimes with Joseph or Anna or both. The cabin had become a touchstone, a physical reminder of first principles, a place to return when the complexity of business success threatened to obscure the simple truths that had made success possible. On a spring evening in 1921, Nathan sat alone at the cabin watching sunset paint the valley below in orange and gold. Margaret was at the mill office finishing accounts. Joseph was managing a timber operation in Idaho. Anna was in Missoula negotiating a major contract with railroad contractors. The business was in good hands, the legacy secure, the future provided for. Nathan thought about Samuel, dead now for a decade, buried in Seattle with a simple marker that probably no one ever visited. He thought about their father Joseph, killed in a logging accident that might have been prevented with better safety practices. He thought about their grandfather, the original homesteader who had claimed this land with nothing but an axe and determination. 3 generations of Garrett men, each one facing his own version of the fundamental challenge: how to create value in a world that often seemed designed to extract it, how to build something lasting in circumstances that favored quick profit and short-term thinking, how to maintain integrity when deception seemed easier and more profitable. His grandfather had succeeded through sheer physical labor and stubborn persistence, had transformed raw land into productive homestead through decades of unrelenting work. His father had succeeded through skill and fair dealing, had built a timber company that provided good employment and quality products. Samuel had failed through choosing shortcuts and deception, had destroyed what he inherited and created nothing to replace it. Nathan had succeeded through knowledge and character, through solving problems everyone else considered unsolvable, through building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The mountain that was supposed to be his defeat had become his advantage, because he refused to accept that worthless was an inherent property rather than a judgment that could be changed through effort and intelligence. He stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking up at the larch groves that continued to produce premium timber after 30 years of selective harvesting. The trees his grandfather had seen as saplings were still growing, still adding value, still providing for his family, and for the community that had grown up around his operations. This was the real legacy, Nathan thought. Not the bank accounts or the property deeds or the business contracts, but the understanding that value is created through work and knowledge and character. That worthless land becomes valuable through the right application of human capability. That what matters is not what you inherit, but what you build. Not what advantages you start with, but what you do when those advantages are stripped away. The stone cabin stood behind him, solid and permanent, the walls that had sheltered him that first brutal winter still performing their function 3 decades later. He had built a good life from this foundation, had created something that would outlast him, had proven that betrayal and loss could be transformed into opportunity and success if you refused to quit. Nathan returned to the cabin as full darkness arrived, built a fire in the hearth he had constructed with his own hands, sat at the table he had made from rough larch planks. He would sleep here tonight, on the dirt floor in the old way, reminder and celebration combined. Tomorrow he would return to the house Margaret had helped design, to the business they had built together, to the community that had grown from his vision, and the sweat of dozens of families working together. But tonight, he was alone with the mountain that had saved him, with the cabin that had taught him, with the silence that had forced him to discover who he actually was beneath the layers of family expectation and social conditioning. Samuel had given him this mountain thinking it was punishment, but it had been providence, had been exactly what Nathan needed at exactly the moment he needed it, had stripped away everything except essentials and revealed that the essentials were enough, were more than enough if properly applied. Nathan lay down on the dirt floor wrapped in the same wool blanket he had used that first winter, the fabric worn thin now but still serviceable, still providing warmth. Above him, the larch timber roof he had built 3 decades ago still held firm, still kept out weather, still sheltered him as it had sheltered him when he had nothing except determination and a plan that might fail. But it had not failed. None of it had failed. The worthless mountain had become valuable, the betrayal had become opportunity, the isolation had become strength, the cabin had become shrine. And Nathan Garrett, lying on a dirt floor at 56 years old with wealth and family and legacy secured, felt the profound satisfaction of a man who had taken the worst circumstances could offer and transformed them into the best possible outcome. The mountain had taught him well, had taught him that value is created, not given, that character matters more than circumstances, that the only inheritance worth leaving is the knowledge of how to build something from nothing, how to persist when quitting seems rational, how to create value where others see only obstacles. His children knew these lessons. His community embodied these principles. His business operated on these values. The legacy was secure. Nathan closed his eyes and let the mountain silence surround him. Let the stone walls hold him. Let the knowledge of what he had built from worthless land settle over him like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring its challenges and opportunities. But tonight he rested in the place where his journey had truly begun, in the cabin that had saved him, on the mountain that had revealed him to himself. And he knew with absolute certainty that Samuel had been wrong about everything that mattered. The worthless mountain was the most valuable inheritance Nathan ever received. The punishment was actually providence, and the brother who tried to destroy him had instead given him exactly what he needed to build something that would endure long after both of them were gone. The fire burned low in the hearth. The mountain stood silent around him, and Nathan Garrett slept peacefully, knowing he had built well, knowing his legacy was secure, knowing that worthless land in the right hands had become priceless beyond any measure Samuel ever understood.